There are villains in Gotham who want money, power, or chaos, but Hugo Strange is different because what he wants is far more unsettling. He wants to understand people completely, to look inside the human mind, uncover every fear, every weakness, every hidden wound, and use that knowledge to control them. Long before Gotham's louder monsters began terrorizing the city, Strange was already quietly studying broken minds behind clean office walls and medical authority. But the deeper he explored fear and identity, the more he lost himself inside the darkness he once claimed to observe. This is not just the story of a villain, but the story of a man who understood human weakness so deeply that he slowly became something terrifying himself, proving that in Gotham, the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who speak softly and know exactly how people think. The man who watched too closely. Long before Gotham became known for laughing killers, theatrical criminals, and masked figures standing beneath flashing lights, there were already people quietly changing the city from the inside. People whose danger did not come from explosions or public violence, but from the way they studied others with calm eyes and endless patience. And among those early figures, there was one man who felt different from the rest. Someone who carried a silence around him that seemed heavier than anger, heavier even than fear, because it was the silence of someone who believed every human being could eventually be opened like a locked box if he simply watched long enough, listened carefully enough, and removed enough layers from the surface. Hugo Strange did not enter Gotham like a storm, and he did not arrive with dramatic speeches or obvious cruelty, because the unsettling thing about him was never loudness, but patience. And even in the earliest years of his life, there was already something deeply unusual in the way he looked at people. Not with warmth or curiosity in the normal sense, but with a detached attention that made conversations feel less like human interaction and more like examination, as though every person standing in front of him was unknowingly becoming part of a study they had never agreed to join. In Gotham, this kind of person could easily disappear into the background, because the city had always been full of wounded people trying to survive without showing weakness, and in streets covered by rainwater, smoke, and tired yellow lights, strange behavior often blended into the larger sadness surrounding everything, allowing dangerous minds to grow quietly without interruption. The city itself seemed to encourage hidden damage rather than expose it, because Gotham was not a place where pain exploded immediately into chaos, but a place where suffering settled into silence, sank into apartment walls, drifted through crowded train stations, and lived quietly behind office windows and hospital doors where nobody looked too closely. This was the kind of world where Hugo Strange began to shape himself, and while others around him became fascinated with power, wealth, politics, or violence, he became fascinated with something far more intimate and disturbing, which was the hidden structure of the human mind itself. He wanted to know why people lied even when the truth might save them, why fear could control someone more completely than chains, why shame could shape a person's entire identity without anyone noticing, and why certain desires stayed buried so deeply inside people that they barely admitted those feelings to themselves. For most people, these questions might lead toward compassion or understanding, but for Strange they became something colder, because he did not study human emotion in order to help people heal from it. And he did not approach damaged minds with sympathy, but instead with the distant focus of someone examining insects beneath glass, separating behavior into patterns, weaknesses, and predictable reactions that could eventually be controlled if understood deeply enough. Even as a young man, there were signs that something inside him did not connect to others in the usual way. Teachers admired his intelligence because he absorbed information quickly and remembered details with frightening precision. Yet classmates often described him as unsettling without fully understanding why. He spoke politely, carried himself carefully, and rarely lost control emotionally. But beneath that calm surface, there was always the feeling that he was observing rather than participating, measuring reactions instead of sharing them. Conversations with him sometimes left people uncomfortable long after they ended, because Strange listened too carefully, noticed too much, and asked questions that seemed to peel away emotional layers others preferred to keep hidden. Over time, psychology became the perfect path for someone like him, because it offered not only knowledge, but authority, and in Gotham, authority often protected dangerous people more effectively than weapons ever could. Inside classrooms, medical offices, and research halls, Strange discovered a world where human vulnerability could be studied openly, where fear, trauma, obsession, and identity could all be broken apart into theories and diagnoses. And while other students focused on healing patients, Strange became increasingly interested in control itself, in the possibility that human behavior could eventually become something predictable enough to manipulate completely. There was something deeply disturbing in the way he viewed identity, because he did not believe people truly knew themselves at all. To him, every person was simply wearing layers built from fear, social pressure, memory, and hidden desire. And beneath those layers, he believed there was always another self waiting quietly underneath, something more honest, more desperate, and often far darker than society allowed people to admit. He believed masks existed everywhere, not just on criminals or performers, but on ordinary citizens walking through Gotham every day, pretending to be stable, pretending to be moral, pretending to understand themselves while secretly hiding confusion and hunger they barely recognized. This belief slowly became the center of his thinking, and the more he studied people, the less human they seemed to him emotionally. Patients became case studies. Trauma became useful information. Fear became a tool. Weakness became opportunity. While Gotham slept beneath flickering neon signs and distant sirens, Strange spent long nights reading medical reports, criminal records, psychiatric evaluations, and behavioral studies, building an endless map of human fragility inside his mind. He did not see suffering as tragic in the normal sense. Instead, he saw it as revealing. Pain stripped away performance. Desperation exposed truth. Fear uncovered instinct. In another city, perhaps someone like him might have remained isolated, limited by rules, ethics, or oversight. But Gotham was already beginning to decay in ways that created room for minds like Strange to grow stronger. Hospitals were overcrowded. Corruption spread quietly through institutions meant to protect people. Wealth and poverty existed side by side like two different worlds, staring at each other across dark streets. Beneath the city's towering buildings, there was exhaustion everywhere, hidden behind tired smiles and locked apartment doors. And in places where emotional damage becomes common, people often stop noticing warning signs until it is far too late. That was what made Gotham dangerous long before its famous villains emerged publicly into the world. The city normalized brokenness. It taught people to survive discomfort rather than confront it. Silence became part of daily life. Families hid abuse. Officials ignored corruption. Patients disappeared into forgotten corners of medical systems that barely functioned. And inside that environment, someone like Hugo Strange could operate almost invisibly, because his cruelty did not arrive through open brutality at first, but through observation, analysis, and slow psychological pressure that left almost no visible scars. There were moments when patients reportedly felt exposed simply sitting across from him, as though he could see private thoughts forming before they fully understood them themselves. Strange had an unusual ability to identify emotional fractures quickly, noticing hesitation in speech, tension in posture, small changes in breathing, or unconscious movements most people ignored completely. But instead of using those observations gently, he seemed fascinated by pushing deeper into discomfort, exploring insecurity the way others might explore caves or hidden rooms. The unsettling truth was that he genuinely enjoyed understanding people in this way, not because it created connection, but because it created power. Knowledge made him feel elevated above others. If he could predict behavior, expose secrets, or influence decisions emotionally, then he no longer had to see people as equals. They became systems to navigate, minds to unlock, structures waiting to collapse if enough pressure was applied in the correct places. And yet, despite all of this, Hugo Strange rarely appeared monstrous on the surface. That was part of what made him so difficult to recognize early on. He did not resemble the violent criminals Gotham would later fear openly. He looked educated, composed, even respectable. He spoke calmly. He dressed neatly. He moved through professional spaces with quiet confidence. But beneath that controlled appearance, there was already something deeply hollow growing stronger over time, because every year he spent reducing human beings into patterns and weaknesses pulled him further away from empathy itself. To Strange, emotions were not sacred parts of being human. They were mechanisms. Love could become attachment. Attachment could become fear of loss. Fear of loss could become obedience. Shame could create secrecy. Isolation could create dependency. Every emotional experience could eventually be mapped, understood, and used. This way of thinking slowly removed any barrier between science and exploitation. Because once a person stops seeing others as fully human, emotionally, almost anything becomes justifiable in the pursuit of knowledge. And Gotham, with all its hidden suffering and endless loneliness, provided an endless supply of people already standing near emotional collapse. Far above the streets, rain rolled down dark windows while exhausted office workers rode trains home in silence. Criminals exchanged money in narrow alleys beneath weak streetlights. And families sat in apartments pretending not to hear arguments through thin walls. And somewhere within that endless city movement, Hugo Strange continued watching, studying, listening, quietly building an understanding of human weakness piece by piece, long before most of Gotham even knew his name. He did not crave destruction in the simple way others eventually would. He was not chasing noise, spectacle, or public fear. What he wanted was far more personal and far more disturbing, because he wanted complete understanding, complete psychological access, the ability to peel away every hidden layer, protecting a person's inner self until nothing remained concealed anymore. And perhaps the most frightening part was that he truly believed this made him wiser than everyone else around him, not cruel, not evil, but enlightened, as though removing privacy, emotional safety, and personal identity from another human being was simply part of discovering truth. In the years ahead, Gotham would become filled with louder monsters, figures whose crimes painted the city in fire and blood beneath the night sky. But even among them, there would always remain something uniquely unsettling about Hugo Strange, because unlike those who sought chaos openly, he sought intimacy, understanding, and control. And he approached the human mind not as something sacred, but as something waiting patiently to be opened. A brilliant mind hidden behind polite eyes. As the years moved forward and Gotham continued growing heavier beneath its endless clouds, Hugo Strange slowly transformed from an unsettling observer into something far more respected. Because intelligence has always carried a strange kind of protection in cities, desperate for answers, and in a place filled with corruption, violence, addiction, and emotional collapse, people often welcomed brilliant minds without questioning what might exist beneath the surface of that brilliance. Gotham admired intelligence the same way drowning people admire boats in the distance, with desperation strong enough to ignore warning signs. And for someone like Strange, this environment became the perfect place to rise quietly through academic halls and medical institutions, while very few truly understood the kind of person standing in front of them. At first, his success seemed almost inevitable. Professors praised his memory, his focus, and the unnatural speed with which he absorbed complicated material. While other students struggled through long medical texts and emotional case studies, Strange appeared calm and comfortable, moving through difficult subjects with the cold patience of someone assembling machinery rather than learning about living people. He performed exceptionally well in psychology, neurology, behavioral science, and psychiatric theory, and many around him believed they were witnessing the growth of a remarkable medical mind that might one day help reshape the understanding of mental illness itself. But admiration can become dangerous when it reaches someone who already feels disconnected from others emotionally, because praise does not always create humility. Sometimes it creates distance. Sometimes it convinces a person they are standing above ordinary rules. And with every compliment Strange received, every award handed to him, and every approving glance from respected academics, a quiet transformation began inside him, slow enough that nobody fully noticed it happening until much later. The more recognition he earned, the more convinced he became that intelligence itself separated certain people from the rest of humanity. And in his mind, those with exceptional understanding should not be limited by the same moral boundaries that controlled everyone else. He began seeing ethics not as necessary protection, but as obstacles created by weaker minds afraid of uncomfortable truths. To Strange, morality often appeared emotional rather than logical, and because he trusted logic far more than emotion, he slowly convinced himself that ethical limits only delayed scientific progress. This belief did not appear suddenly. It grew carefully, almost invisibly, hidden behind professional behavior and academic discipline. In classrooms, he still spoke politely. During conferences, he remained calm and articulate. In medical discussions, he sounded thoughtful and intelligent. Yet beneath those composed conversations, there was already a dangerous idea forming, the idea that human beings could not truly evolve unless someone was willing to step beyond traditional ideas of right and wrong. He often studied historical figures who changed science through controversial experiments, and while others focused on the suffering caused by those actions, Strange focused on the results. He became fascinated with the idea that history sometimes remembered outcomes more strongly than cruelty, and this way of thinking slowly reshaped his understanding of responsibility. If knowledge could transform society, then perhaps temporary suffering became acceptable. If psychological experimentation uncovered deeper truths about human behavior, then perhaps emotional discomfort no longer mattered. It was during his medical training that many people began noticing how unusually detached he could become during difficult cases. Where other students hesitated emotionally while discussing trauma patients or severe psychiatric conditions, Strange remained composed with almost unnatural stillness. Some interpreted this as professionalism. Others quietly found it disturbing. There were moments when patients described feeling uneasy during evaluations, not because he behaved aggressively, but because his attention felt invasive, as though he were mentally taking them apart piece by piece while maintaining perfect calm on the surface. Yet institutions often reward results more than emotional warmth, especially in places where hospitals are overcrowded and mental illness is rising faster than systems can manage. Gotham's medical world valued efficiency, intelligence, and measurable success, and Strange provided all three. His research papers gained attention. His observations were detailed and precise. Senior psychiatrists began viewing him as one of the brightest minds of his generation. Invitations to academic events increased. Medical boards praised his insight into criminal behavior and emotional disorders. Even those unsettled by him struggled to deny his effectiveness. The respect surrounding him became almost addictive, not fame in the normal sense, because Hugo Strange did not crave applause or public celebration the way politicians or performers might. What he craved was validation of superiority, proof that his mind operated differently from everyone else around him. Each success reinforced his growing belief that he was capable of understanding human beings more deeply than ordinary people ever could. And once someone truly begins believing that, empathy often starts fading quietly in the background. He became increasingly convinced that most people did not actually control their own lives at all. In his view, behavior was driven by hidden fears, unconscious desires, childhood trauma, social pressure, chemical imbalance, and emotional weakness. People imagined themselves free, but Strange believed they were simply reacting to invisible psychological forces they barely understood. And if those forces could be identified clearly enough, then behavior itself could eventually be directed, adjusted, or manipulated with precision. This idea fascinated him more than money, status, or even scientific recognition. Control became the center of everything, not physical control in the obvious sense, but mental control, emotional control, the ability to influence thoughts before actions even occurred. Strange wanted to know how fear changed decision-making, how shame shaped identity, how loneliness weakened resistance, and how authority could slowly reshape a person's entire sense of reality. He studied hypnosis, behavioral conditioning, emotional dependency, and psychological suggestion with growing obsession, not simply as academic subjects, but as pathways toward deeper influence over the human mind. And the frightening thing was that he approached these ideas with genuine excitement rather than guilt. While other researchers debated ethical concerns surrounding psychological experimentation, Strange often appeared impatient with such conversations. To him, emotional hesitation represented weakness disguised as morality. He believed people protected harmful limitations because they were afraid of what might happen if science moved too far forward too quickly. But Strange was not afraid of crossing lines. In fact, he seemed drawn toward forbidden territory precisely because others avoided it. Some colleagues admired his boldness. Others whispered concerns privately behind closed office doors. There were stories of him asking deeply uncomfortable questions during research discussions. Questions that focused less on whether certain experiments should happen and more on how effectively they could be performed without resistance. Even then, long before Gotham fully understood who he was becoming, there were already moments where people sensed something cold moving beneath his professionalism, something detached from normal emotional boundaries. Still, he continued rising. Medical institutions welcomed him because results mattered. Universities celebrated him because his work attracted attention. Gotham's growing interest in criminal psychology created even more opportunities for someone like Strange, because the city was producing increasingly violent offenders, emotionally damaged citizens, and unstable minds that fascinated psychiatrists attempting to understand why Gotham seemed uniquely capable of creating psychological collapse on such a massive scale. For Strange, this was not merely tragedy, it was opportunity. Every criminal represented data. Every patient represented access to hidden emotional structures. Every disturbed mind became another doorway into understanding human behavior more completely. He studied violent offenders not with fear, but with curiosity, searching for patterns beneath rage and trauma. He became especially interested in identity itself, the idea that people could separate into multiple selves depending on pressure, fear, and emotional survival. In many ways, Gotham itself strengthened his worldview. The city constantly revealed how fragile morality could become under stress. Corrupt officials smiled during charity events while accepting bribes in secret. Wealthy families protected reputations while hiding emotional abuse behind mansion walls. Ordinary citizens committed desperate acts simply to survive another week. Everywhere Strange looked, he saw evidence supporting his belief that morality was unstable, flexible, and deeply dependent on circumstance. This reinforced something dangerous inside him. If morality shifted so easily under pressure, then perhaps it had never been truly real to begin with. That thought became one of the foundations of his philosophy. Intelligence, he believed, mattered more than traditional ideas of good and evil, because intelligence revealed truth, while morality merely comforted people emotionally. A brilliant mind should not be restrained by the fears of ordinary society. A scientist, willing to go further than others, could uncover realities hidden from weaker thinkers. And once Strange fully accepted this idea, the distance between research and manipulation became smaller and smaller in his mind. There were times during evaluations when he intentionally guided conversations toward emotional discomfort simply to observe reactions more closely. Certain patients later described feeling psychologically exhausted after sessions with him, as though he had deliberately pushed against emotional wounds instead of helping them heal. Yet because Strange remained composed and professional externally, complaints rarely went far. His reputation protected him, his intelligence shielded him. Institutions trusted credentials more than instinct. Meanwhile, his private fascination with psychological influence continued growing stronger. He became increasingly interested in the possibility that identity itself could be reshaped under the correct conditions. Fear could rewrite behavior. Trauma could erase stability. Isolation could create dependency. Repetition could alter belief systems. Strange viewed the mind almost like soft material, waiting to be molded carefully by someone skilled enough to understand its weaknesses. And perhaps the most disturbing part was that he rarely viewed this as cruelty. In his own mind, he saw himself as someone pursuing higher understanding, while lesser thinkers remained trapped by emotional discomfort and outdated ethics. He believed he was moving toward truths society feared confronting. Every barrier he crossed made him feel not guilty, but enlightened, as though his willingness to abandon moral hesitation proved intellectual superiority rather than emotional emptiness. By now, colleagues no longer saw him merely as a promising psychiatrist. He had become respected, influential, even admired in certain circles throughout Gotham's medical and academic communities. Young students studied his work, researchers quoted his findings, administrators praised his discipline and intelligence. From the outside, Hugo Strange looked like the kind of brilliant figure cities depend on during difficult times. But behind those calm eyes and measured words, something far more dangerous was developing quietly, because power itself was never his true addiction. Control was. Not over buildings, money, or political systems, but over something far more intimate and frightening, the human mind itself, with all its fears, secrets, instincts, and hidden desires waiting beneath the surface, waiting for someone patient enough, cold enough, and curious enough to reach inside and take hold of them. Gotham's secret illness. There are cities that fall apart loudly, where destruction arrives through explosions, riots, and burning streets that force everyone to stop and look directly at the damage. But Gotham was different, because its sickness spread quietly beneath everyday life, moving through apartment buildings, hospitals, schools, police stations, and narrow alleyways like something slowly leaking into the ground beneath the city itself. People still went to work every morning. Children still walked to school beneath grey skies. Wealthy families still attended charity events beneath shining chandeliers while orchestras played softly in the background. Yet underneath all of it, there was exhaustion, fear, anger, and loneliness, settling deeper into the city every year, creating a kind of invisible pressure that slowly shaped everyone living inside it. By the time Hugo Strange had become an established figure within Gotham's medical world, he had already begun noticing something that many others either ignored or refused to admit openly, which was that Gotham did not simply contain damaged people, but actively produced them. The city seemed almost designed to wear down the human mind over time. Poverty stood beside enormous wealth, like a wound that never healed. Corruption moved through government offices, so naturally that honesty often looked unusual. Violent crime became common enough that entire neighborhoods stopped reacting to distant sirens at night. Even ordinary citizens carried tension in their faces while riding trains or walking crowded sidewalks, as though everyone expected something terrible to happen eventually. For many doctors and psychiatrists, Gotham represented a humanitarian crisis, requiring compassion, reform, and stronger social support systems. But for Strange, the city became something else entirely. He did not look at Gotham and see tragedy in the emotional sense. He saw patterns, he saw reactions, he saw opportunities to study human behavior under constant pressure. While others spoke about helping people recover from trauma, Strange became fascinated by the idea that Gotham itself functioned like an enormous psychological experiment, already unfolding naturally around him. The city never truly rested. Even late at night, When rainwater reflected weak neon signs across empty streets, there was always movement somewhere beneath the darkness. Ambulances carried overdose victims through traffic. Police officers dragged exhausted criminals into overcrowded stations. Families argued inside tiny apartments where stress had replaced warmth long ago. In emergency rooms, nurses moved between patients with tired eyes, while doctors rushed through evaluations because there simply were too many people needing help and never enough time to properly care for them all. And in the middle of that endless exhaustion stood Gotham's mental health system, struggling under pressure it could no longer contain. Hospitals overflowed constantly. Psychiatric wards held more patients than available beds. Underpaid workers tried to manage violent breakdowns, addiction, trauma, and severe emotional instability with limited resources and fading patience. Many people suffering from serious mental illness slipped through the system entirely, left untreated until their conditions became dangerous both to themselves and others. Some disappeared into the streets. Others cycled endlessly between arrests, hospital stays, and temporary releases that solved nothing. To most doctors, these conditions were heartbreaking. To Hugo Strange, they were revealing. He spent long periods studying institutional failure throughout Gotham, reading reports about overcrowded clinics, reviewing criminal case histories connected to untreated psychiatric conditions, and examining how stress altered behavior across different social classes. The more information he gathered, the more convinced he became that Gotham was exposing truths about human psychology more honestly than healthier cities ever could. In places where comfort exists, people hide themselves more easily. In Gotham, pressure stripped those layers away. Fear changed morality, hunger changed decision-making, trauma reshaped identity, isolation distorted reality. Strange watched people collapse emotionally under stress and found himself increasingly drawn toward the mechanics behind those collapses rather than the suffering itself. Every desperate act seemed to confirm his growing belief that human behavior could eventually be predicted if enough variables were understood clearly enough. And because Gotham produced endless desperation, it produced endless data. Traditional psychiatry began frustrating him more with every passing year. He saw therapists repeating careful ethical language while patients continued deteriorating around them. He watched medical boards debate moral limitations, while violent crime increased and psychiatric institutions lost control of entire wings. To Strange, modern psychiatry seemed weak, hesitant, and emotionally trapped by outdated ideas about dignity and consent. He believed doctors were too afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. In his view, many mental illnesses could not be understood through gentle conversation alone. Human beings under normal conditions hid too much of themselves. They performed stability. They lied about desires. They buried instincts beneath social behavior. Strange became convinced that true understanding required pressure, emotional disruption, and carefully controlled psychological exposure capable of stripping away artificial identity. This idea slowly pushed him further away from ethical medicine. The more he studied Gotham, the less faith he placed in compassion as a solution. Kindness, he believed, often delayed real understanding because it protected people from confronting their deeper instincts. Traditional psychiatric care focused on comfort, stabilization, and emotional support, but Strange increasingly believed these approaches merely covered symptoms without revealing the hidden structures underneath human behavior. He wanted access to what existed beneath fear, beneath shame, beneath identity itself. At times, Gotham almost seemed to encourage these thoughts naturally. The city rewarded survival more than morality. Corrupt officials remained powerful despite public scandals. Violent criminals gained influence through intimidation. Wealthy elites avoided consequences through money and political connections. Everywhere Strange looked, systems designed to protect people appeared broken or compromised. This deeply affected the direction of his thinking. If institutions themselves were failing, then perhaps ethical limitations were already meaningless. Perhaps morality had always been fragile, existing only when circumstances allowed it to survive comfortably. Gotham constantly demonstrated how quickly ordinary people abandon principles under pressure, and Strange interpreted this not as evidence of tragedy, but as proof that human identity was far less stable than society pretended. As his reputation grew, he gained increasing access to Gotham's damaged population. Patients arrived carrying lives filled with neglect, addiction, violence, paranoia, grief, and emotional collapse. Some suffered from hallucinations so vivid they could barely separate reality from fear. Others had survived abuse so severe that trust itself felt impossible. Strange listened carefully during evaluations, but not with sympathy. He listened with analytical fascination, studying how trauma reshaped memory, behavior, and self-perception. In many cases, he seemed more interested in how far a mind could bend before breaking than in helping it recover afterward. Certain colleagues began quietly noticing changes in his methods. His evaluations became more invasive psychologically. His questioning pushed patients toward discomfort rather than reassurance. Some sessions lasted unusually long because Strange appeared unwilling to stop once emotional vulnerability surfaced. He often described patients using detached scientific language that disturbed even experienced professionals, reducing deeply personal suffering into observable behavioral mechanisms rather than human experiences. Yet Gotham's collapsing systems protected him in strange ways. Because institutions were overwhelmed, results mattered more than process. Administrators focused on reducing violence, stabilizing unstable patients, and managing public pressure, rather than carefully monitoring every psychiatrist's methods. Hospitals needed intelligent specialists capable of handling increasingly dangerous cases, and Strange remained highly effective according to measurable standards. Patients responded intensely during sessions. Criminal profiles proved accurate. Behavioral predictions often matched reality with frightening precision. Very few people stopped to ask whether effectiveness without empathy could eventually become dangerous. Meanwhile, Gotham itself continued decaying quietly around him. Entire neighborhoods carried the feeling of emotional abandonment. Broken streetlights flickered beside neglected apartment buildings where children learned fear before adulthood. Drug addiction spread through communities already struggling with poverty and crime. Some schools lacked counselors entirely, despite growing violence among students. Police officers grew more aggressive under constant pressure, while public trust in institutions weakened further every year. The city seemed trapped in a cycle where trauma continuously created more trauma. For Hugo Strange, this environment no longer resembled a place needing salvation. It resembled a living laboratory. Every social collapse revealed behavioral patterns. Every emotional breakdown exposed hidden psychological structures. Gotham's suffering created conditions impossible to reproduce ethically inside controlled research settings, and this realization fascinated him deeply. The city naturally generated fear, desperation, paranoia, aggression, dependency, and instability on a massive scale. To Strange, these conditions offered unprecedented access to the human mind under pressure. The frightening part was how calmly he accepted this perspective. While others mourned Gotham's decline emotionally, Strange observed it clinically, almost academically. He walked through hospital corridors, listening to distant screaming from psychiatric wards, not with horror, but with concentration. He reviewed reports, describing violent emotional episodes, while taking careful notes about behavioral triggers. He studied corruption scandals and criminal psychology with the detached focus of someone assembling a complicated puzzle piece by piece. And slowly, the line separating observation from experimentation began fading inside him. He started questioning why psychological research should remain limited to passive study when Gotham itself was already exposing minds to constant emotional pressure naturally. If fear altered behavior, why not study fear more directly? If identity shifted under trauma, why not examine those shifts intentionally? Strange became increasingly convinced that ethical medicine prevented meaningful progress because it prioritized emotional comfort over discovery. In quieter moments, hidden beneath his professional language and polished public image, there was already something deeply dangerous, growing stronger within him. A belief that human beings existed not as sacred individuals deserving protection, but as psychological systems waiting to be explored completely. Gotham encouraged this belief every day. The city hid suffering behind routines so effectively that people stopped reacting to warning signs. Ambulance sirens faded into background noise. Corruption became expected. Emotional instability became ordinary. Institutions normalized overcrowding, neglect, and desperation simply to continue functioning at all. In that environment, extreme ideas no longer appeared extreme for very long. And because Gotham constantly blurred moral boundaries, Hugo Strange found it easier and easier to justify the direction his thinking was taking. By now, he no longer viewed ethical medicine as admirable restraint. He viewed it as weakness, disguised as compassion. He believed psychiatry had become too protective, too emotional, too afraid to examine uncomfortable realities about human behavior. Gotham, meanwhile, exposed those realities constantly through violence, addiction, psychological collapse, and social decay unfolding across every corner of the city. The difference was that most people saw catastrophe where Strange saw possibility. Late at night, while cold rain drifted across Gotham's rooftops and distant traffic echoed through narrow streets below, he often sat surrounded by patient records, behavioral studies, criminal profiles, and psychiatric evaluations, quietly studying the city's damaged population with endless concentration. Thousands of minds, thousands of fears, thousands of hidden fractures waiting to be understood. And somewhere within that endless observation, the city's illness slowly became his own. Not because Gotham drove him insane in the ordinary sense, but because it convinced him more deeply each year that human suffering was not something to heal first, but something to examine, pressure, and uncover until every hidden part of the mind finally revealed itself completely. The birth of obsession. By the time Gotham first began whispering about a creature moving through the rooftops at night, Hugo Strange had already spent years studying broken minds, criminal behavior, emotional collapse, and the slow decay spreading through the city's institutions. Yet nothing he had encountered before prepared him for the strange feeling that entered his thoughts the moment he first heard reports about a dark figure dressed like a bat, appearing at crime scenes without warning and disappearing again, before police could fully understand what they had witnessed. At first, the story sounded absurd even by Gotham standards, because the city had always been filled with rumors born from fear and exhaustion, and many officials dismissed the sightings as exaggerations created by frightened criminals searching for excuses after failed robberies or violent arrests. But Strange listened differently. While others focused on whether the figure truly existed, Strange became interested in why the stories were spreading so quickly and with such emotional intensity. Criminals described overwhelming fear before they even realized what they were looking at. Witnesses spoke about shadows moving unnaturally across rooftops. Some officers claimed hardened gang members had suffered near panic attacks after brief encounters with the masked figure. The details varied from story to story, but one thing remained consistent every single time. Whoever this person was, they understood fear. That detail alone captured Hugo Strange's attention more deeply than any violent criminal ever had. Most criminals in Gotham acted from greed, anger, desperation, or emotional instability. Even dangerous killers often revealed predictable psychological patterns once examined closely enough. Strange had spent years analyzing violent offenders and eventually found many of them disappointing beneath the surface. They were reactive, emotional, impulsive. Their crimes often exposed insecurity rather than intelligence. But this new figure moving through Gotham's darkness felt different from the beginning, because nothing about the reports suggested emotional chaos. Everything suggested control. The stories described someone disciplined enough to transform himself into a symbol, someone intelligent enough to manipulate fear psychologically, rather than relying only on physical violence, and someone patient enough to operate almost entirely from the shadows, while allowing rumors to grow naturally around him. Strange quickly realized that Gotham was not simply witnessing another criminal or vigilante. Something far more unusual was happening. For the first time in many years, Hugo Strange felt genuine curiosity awaken inside him with unexpected force. He began collecting newspaper reports, police records, witness statements, and criminal testimonies connected to the mysterious figure the city had started calling Batman. Late at night, while cold wind rattled windows across Gotham and distant sirens echoed through sleeping neighborhoods, Strange sat alone, studying every available detail with growing concentration. Unlike ordinary observers searching for answers about Batman's identity, Strange became interested in psychological structure first. Why a bat? Why darkness? Why silence? Why theatrical fear instead of public recognition? These questions fascinated him endlessly because they pointed towards something deeper than simple crime fighting. Strange believed symbols revealed hidden emotional truths about the people who created them, and Batman's entire existence seemed carefully constructed around emotional impact rather than practicality alone. The costume was not random. The behavior was not random. Even the methods carried psychological intention. This realization disturbed and excited him at the same time. For years, Strange had believed he understood the mechanics of fear more clearly than almost anyone else in Gotham. He had studied trauma, manipulation, emotional weakness, and behavioral conditioning with obsessive focus. But Batman appeared to be using those same principles instinctively out in the streets, transforming himself into something larger than human through carefully controlled psychological performance. And unlike the unstable criminals Strange usually studied, Batman remained hidden behind complete mystery. That mystery consumed him almost immediately. At first, Strange approached the subject academically. He wrote private observations, analyzing Batman's methods, movement patterns, and symbolic choices. He theorized about personality traits based on reported behavior during confrontations. He examined how criminals reacted emotionally after encounters with the masked figure. Some became terrified. Others grew paranoid. Certain gang members reportedly refused to operate at night entirely after hearing stories from associates. Batman was reshaping criminal psychology across Gotham simply through presence and uncertainty. To Strange, this was extraordinary. Most forms of control required systems, institutions, or direct authority. Batman seemed capable of influencing behavior through myth alone. That level of psychological influence fascinated Strange more deeply than any medical achievement he had encountered before. In many ways, Batman represented living proof that fear itself could become architecture, something capable of reshaping an entire city's behavior when wielded precisely enough. And yet, beneath all that fascination, another thought slowly began growing stronger inside Hugo Strange's mind. No human being becomes something like Batman without damage. That idea became impossible for him to ignore. Every report describing Batman's relentless behavior, emotional isolation, and obsession with crime reinforced Strange's belief that beneath the mask existed someone psychologically fractured in profound ways. Healthy minds did not dedicate themselves to stalking rooftops at night, dressed as creatures of fear. Ordinary people did not build identities around terror and secrecy. To Strange, Batman's existence itself pointed toward deep emotional trauma hidden beneath discipline and control. This was what truly captured him. Not the costume, not the violence, not even the mystery of identity. What fascinated Hugo Strange most was the possibility that beneath Gotham's terrifying symbol existed a wounded human mind waiting to be understood completely. That thought transformed curiosity into obsession. The more he studied Batman, the more emotionally invested he became in uncovering the psychological truth hiding underneath the surface. He no longer viewed Batman merely as an interesting subject. He began seeing him as the ultimate human case study, someone who had transformed personal suffering into an entire identity powerful enough to influence an entire city psychologically. And if Strange could understand Batman fully, then perhaps he could finally prove everything he believed about trauma, fear, identity, and human behavior. Soon, ordinary criminal evaluations no longer interested him the way they once had. Compared to Batman, other minds seemed simple and predictable. Gotham's violent offenders now felt emotionally transparent beside the dark figure operating through silence and symbolism across the rooftops above them. Strange found himself increasingly distracted during professional work because his thoughts constantly returned to the same question: who chooses to become fear itself? He replayed witness testimonies repeatedly, analyzing specific details others ignored. Batman rarely spoke unnecessarily. He controlled environments carefully during confrontations. He used shadows strategically. He disappeared before emotional tension could fully release. Everything suggested intense self-discipline, mixed with deep emotional isolation. To Strange, these were not random behaviors. They were symptoms. But unlike ordinary psychiatrists, Hugo Strange did not approach symptoms with compassion. He approached them with hunger for understanding. Every new detail about Batman felt like another small glimpse beneath the surface of a locked psychological structure he desperately wanted to open completely. In private moments, Strange sometimes imagined conversations with Batman, not confrontations in the traditional sense, but clinical examinations where layers of emotional defense slowly fell apart beneath careful psychological pressure. He imagined stripping away secrecy piece by piece, exposing childhood trauma, hidden guilt, suppressed fear, and obsessive compulsions buried beneath the mask. Because in Strange's mind, nobody could maintain such an identity without enormous psychological cost. And that cost fascinated him endlessly. What made Batman especially compelling was the contradiction at the center of his existence. Gotham's criminals described him as terrifying, yet he seemed driven by rules. He inspired fear, but targeted violence. He operated outside the law while seemingly trying to protect the city. Strange became obsessed with these contradictions because contradictions often revealed emotional fractures hidden inside personality structures. Batman looked controlled externally, but Strange became convinced that underneath the discipline, there must exist enormous, unresolved pain. He wanted to find it, not to help, not to heal, but to understand. The difference mattered deeply. For most people, discovering emotional wounds in another human being creates empathy. For Hugo Strange, it created fascination. He viewed hidden suffering the way explorers viewed unknown territory, something waiting to be uncovered carefully until every secret finally stood exposed in the open. Batman's emotional complexity represented the greatest psychological mystery he had ever encountered, because unlike ordinary patients, Batman actively transformed trauma into power. That transformation haunted Strange's thoughts constantly. At times, he almost admired Batman intellectually. The identity had been constructed with incredible precision. Fear became weapon, symbol became armor, isolation became discipline. Gotham itself responded emotionally to Batman's existence exactly as intended. Criminal behavior shifted, public imagination changed. Entire sections of the city began psychologically reorganizing around the possibility that the Batman might appear from darkness without warning. This level of influence fascinated Strange almost beyond reason. He began spending nights walking through Gotham, simply observing how people discussed Batman in restaurants, police stations, and crowded sidewalks beneath flickering streetlights. Some citizens viewed him as hope. Others viewed him as dangerous. Criminals spoke about him with visible anxiety. Children whispered stories about him like urban legends. Gotham's emotional atmosphere itself had changed, and Hugo Strange could not stop thinking about the mind responsible for creating that change. He no longer saw Batman as merely a masked vigilante. He saw him as the physical embodiment of psychological transformation. Someone had taken pain, fear, and emotional damage and rebuilt an entirely new identity from those broken pieces. To Strange, that process represented something almost beautiful in a cold, scientific sense. Batman was living evidence that trauma could reshape human beings into something beyond ordinary identity entirely. The obsession deepened quietly. Strange began rearranging research priorities around Batman-related analysis. He reviewed trauma theory constantly, searching for patterns matching Batman's behavioral structure. He studied childhood grief, obsessive behavior, symbolic fixation, emotional compartmentalization, and identity formation with renewed intensity. Certain colleagues noticed his unusual focus on Gotham's vigilante phenomenon, though few understood the depth of his fascination, because by now, Batman had become something personal to Hugo Strange, not an enemy, not even a target, but a puzzle unlike anything else in Gotham, a mind hidden behind layers, strong enough to reshape an entire city emotionally, while remaining almost completely invisible underneath. And the more impossible Batman seemed to understand, the more determined Strange became to uncover every hidden truth buried beneath the mask. Late at night, while Gotham's towers disappeared beneath drifting fog and weak moonlight reflected across wet rooftops, Hugo Strange often sat alone, surrounded by photographs, criminal reports, psychiatric notes, and newspaper articles describing Batman sightings throughout the city. The room remained silent, except for rain tapping softly against windows as he studied the figure endlessly, tracing behavioral patterns with careful attention, trying to imagine the damaged human being existing underneath the terrifying symbol Gotham feared and admired at the same time. Somewhere beneath the armor, beneath the darkness, beneath the myth, Strange believed there had to be emotional wounds deep enough to explain everything. And more than anything else in the world, he wanted to reach inside those wounds and see what was hiding there. The Monster Men experiments. There comes a point in the life of certain dangerous people when thought slowly becomes action, when private ideas stop remaining hidden inside notebooks and quiet conversations and begin entering the real world through irreversible choices. And for Hugo Strange, that moment arrived not through sudden rage or emotional collapse, but through cold confidence built over years of intellectual pride and growing emotional detachment. By now, he no longer viewed himself as simply a psychiatrist studying abnormal behavior from a safe distance. He had started believing something far more dangerous, which was that he possessed the intelligence necessary to reshape human beings directly, to push beyond the limits of ordinary medicine and uncover hidden possibilities buried inside the body and mind. At first, these ideas existed quietly behind locked doors and confidential research notes. Strange spent long hours studying human biology, chemical enhancement, hormonal imbalance, and the effects extreme emotional pressure could have on physical behavior. He became fascinated with the possibility that fear, aggression, survival instinct, and physical strength might all be altered through scientific intervention if the correct formulas could be developed. To him, the human body no longer seemed fixed or sacred. It appeared adjustable, something capable of transformation under enough pressure and experimentation. Most researchers who explored similar theories remained limited by ethical law, public oversight, and fear of consequences. But Hugo Strange had already begun drifting beyond those boundaries mentally long before he crossed them physically. The years spent observing Gotham's corruption and institutional failure had convinced him that morality itself was unstable and selective. Powerful people broke rules constantly while hiding behind legal systems. Wealth protected criminals. Violence shaped political decisions. Hospitals ignored suffering they lacked resources to manage. To Strange, society already operated through hypocrisy, so why should science remain restrained? That question became more dangerous every year. Somewhere inside him, the final hesitation disappeared quietly. There was no dramatic moment where he announced his rejection of ethical medicine aloud. No emotional breakdown, no public scandal. Instead, there was simply a growing certainty that his work mattered more than ordinary human limitations. If rules prevented discovery, then rules themselves became the problem. Soon afterward, Strange began conducting experiments outside approved medical environments, using hidden facilities and unofficial research spaces far removed from public oversight. Certain abandoned buildings throughout Gotham became temporary laboratories where damaged equipment hummed softly beneath flickering lights, while chemical formulas lined metal tables beside medical records and handwritten behavioral observations. The rooms smelled faintly of disinfectant, rust, and old concrete soaked by years of leaking rainwater from the city above. And inside those hidden spaces, human beings slowly stopped becoming patients in Strange's eyes. They became material. The first people drawn into these experiments were often individuals Gotham had already forgotten, vulnerable people living near the edges of survival where disappearances attracted little attention. Some were homeless. Others suffered from addiction, severe emotional instability, or desperate financial conditions. Gotham was full of people invisible to institutions, unless they caused problems publicly, and Strange understood this deeply. The city itself provided endless access to individuals unlikely to be protected by anyone powerful enough to stop him. What made his actions especially disturbing was the calmness surrounding them. Strange did not behave like a screaming madman consumed by obvious cruelty. He remained composed, methodical, and professional, even while crossing horrifying lines. He spoke softly during evaluations. He took careful notes. He monitored physical reactions with clinical precision. His voice rarely rose emotionally, even when experiments caused visible suffering. To Strange, emotional distance proved scientific discipline rather than moral emptiness. That belief allowed him to continue. At first, many of the chemical trials focused on physical enhancement. Strange wanted to understand whether aggression, endurance, and instinctive survival responses could be amplified beyond normal human limitations. He experimented with compounds affecting adrenal response, muscular growth, neurological stimulation, and emotional inhibition. But the human body reacted unpredictably under such extreme manipulation, especially when combined with psychological stress and unstable chemical mixtures. The results were horrifying. Subjects began suffering severe emotional disorientation, violent behavioral shifts, and grotesque physical changes as the experiments intensified. Some experienced uncontrollable rage. Others lost coherent speech entirely. Bodies expanded unnaturally under chemical stress, while nervous systems struggled to process overwhelming biological changes. Bones strained beneath accelerated growth. Skin hardened and stretched unevenly. Emotional instability merged with physical transformation until the people inside those hidden laboratories barely resembled themselves anymore. These were the beginnings of what Gotham would eventually know as the Monster Men. The name itself carried a terrible sadness beneath its horror, because these creatures had once been ordinary human beings, people already broken down by Gotham long before Hugo Strange transformed them further. Some had likely hoped for help, others may have believed they were participating in legitimate medical treatment, but once the experiments began, individuality disappeared quickly beneath chemical alteration and psychological collapse. Strange watched all of this unfold with disturbing concentration. Where others would have seen unbearable suffering, he saw data. Even failed experiments fascinated him because failure still revealed information. Every emotional breakdown, every violent reaction, every physical mutation added to his understanding of how human beings responded under extreme biological and psychological pressure. He documented behavioral changes carefully while remaining emotionally distant from the pain surrounding him. At times, the contrast between his appearance and his actions felt almost impossible to understand. He still wore clean, professional clothing. He still spoke with measured politeness. He still carried himself like an educated psychiatrist. giving academic lectures rather than a man overseeing grotesque transformations hidden beneath Gotham's forgotten corners. Yet beneath that calm exterior, he had fully crossed into something monstrous. The monster men themselves became living symbols of Strange's philosophy. He believed human beings were fragile structures hiding more primal instincts underneath, and through chemical experimentation, he attempted to strip away emotional restraint entirely, exposing raw aggression and survival behavior in physical form. But instead of creating stronger humans, he created unstable creatures trapped between pain, confusion, and uncontrollable violence. Some reports later described enormous figures moving through dark industrial districts late at night, their movements clumsy yet terrifyingly powerful, their minds shattered by experimental trauma they could no longer understand. Witnesses spoke about distorted faces, filled not only with rage, but with visible suffering, as though fragments of human awareness still remained trapped beneath the transformations. This was perhaps the cruelest part of Strange's experiments. He did not merely create monsters. He imprisoned damaged people inside monstrous bodies. And still, he continued. By now, any remaining ethical boundary had completely disappeared from his thinking. Human consent no longer mattered. Emotional harm no longer mattered. Permanent psychological destruction no longer mattered. Strange justified everything through intellectual superiority, convincing himself that temporary suffering meant little besides scientific advancement. If terrible discoveries uncovered deeper truths about human potential, then perhaps horror became necessary. This logic allowed him to detach completely from empathy. The laboratory environments themselves reflected this emotional coldness. Metal restraints bolted to examination tables, recording equipment capturing behavioral reactions, thick handwritten files documenting physical deterioration alongside psychological observations. Strange moved through these rooms with quiet precision, adjusting chemicals, monitoring pulse rates, recording emotional shifts, all while people screamed, trembled, or lost themselves beneath experimental pressure. And the most unsettling thing was how ordinary he appeared while doing it. There were no emotional outbursts, no dramatic declarations of evil. Strange behaved like a dedicated professional, performing difficult but necessary work. He genuinely believed his intelligence elevated him beyond ordinary morality, and because of that belief, brutality no longer looked like brutality in his own eyes. It looked like progress. Meanwhile, Gotham remained largely unaware of the nightmare growing beneath its streets and abandoned structures. The city continued drowning in corruption, violence, and emotional exhaustion, while hidden experiments unfolded quietly in forgotten spaces. Nobody important cared enough to investigate closely. Missing people disappeared into statistical background noise. Strange's professional reputation protected him from suspicion. Institutions trusted credentials more than instinct. And because Gotham itself had already normalized suffering, the warning signs rarely reached public attention before it was too late. Still, whispers began spreading gradually through criminal circles and late-night police conversations. Strange sightings, distorted figures attacking violently without clear purpose, rumors of secret experiments hidden somewhere inside Gotham's industrial decay. Most people dismissed these stories as paranoia or urban myth, but fear slowly moved through certain parts of the city anyway, carried quietly between exhausted officers, frightened witnesses, and survivors who had seen things difficult to explain rationally. For Hugo Strange, however, fear itself remained secondary. What mattered was access, control, discovery. Each experiment pushed him further from ordinary humanity emotionally, while strengthening his obsession with psychological and biological transformation. The monster men represented more than failed scientific subjects. They represented proof that identity could be broken apart physically and mentally under enough pressure. Human beings were not stable, fixed creatures. They were malleable systems capable of terrifying change. This idea thrilled him. And somewhere deep inside his increasingly detached mind, another thought continued growing stronger alongside the experiments. If human identity could be reshaped chemically and psychologically this dramatically, then what hidden structures existed beneath someone like Batman? The question lingered constantly beneath his work. Batman remained Gotham's greatest psychological mystery, and Strange's growing experience with emotional manipulation and human transformation only deepened his obsession with uncovering the mind hidden beneath the mask. The Monster Men experiments taught him something important, something both horrifying and seductive. Everyone breaks eventually. Bodies break, minds break, identities break, and Hugo Strange had begun believing that with enough pressure, enough knowledge, and enough control, there was no human being he could not eventually take apart piece by piece. Late at night, while distant thunder rolled across Gotham's skyline and rainwater dripped through cracked ceilings into hidden laboratory rooms below the city, Strange often stood quietly observing the creatures his experiments had created. Massive distorted figures breathing heavily beneath harsh artificial light, fragments of humanity barely visible behind confused eyes filled with suffering and rage. Most people looking at those creatures would have seen only horror. Hugo Strange looked at them and saw possibility. Arkham Asylum, a kingdom of broken minds. There were many places throughout Gotham where suffering hid quietly behind locked doors, but few carried the same heavy feeling as Arkham Asylum, a place built with the promise of healing yet filled for decades with fear, isolation, confusion, and emotional collapse, echoing endlessly through cold hallways beneath dim fluorescent lights. Long before Hugo Strange fully established himself within its walls, Arkham already stood like a monument to Gotham's failure to understand the minds it feared most. Officially, it was a psychiatric institution designed to treat the criminally insane and emotionally unstable. In reality, it often felt closer to a forgotten kingdom, built from loneliness, restraint, and despair. The building itself seemed exhausted by its own history. Cracked walls carried stains from decades of neglect. Rust gathered slowly around old pipes, hidden behind narrow corridors where weak light flickered during quiet hours of the night. Security doors opened with harsh metallic sounds that echoed through the institution like warnings. Even the air inside Arkham felt different from the rest of Gotham, heavier somehow, filled with the scent of disinfectant mixed with damp stone, aging paper, and the lingering tension of people trapped too long inside their own minds. Most ordinary citizens feared Arkham from a distance, imagining it as a place filled only with violent criminals and unstable monsters. But Hugo Strange saw something far more valuable the moment he entered deeper into its systems and routines. To him, Arkham was not simply a hospital or prison. It was an environment where control could operate almost without limits. Behind medical authority, locked security systems, and psychiatric language, almost anything could be justified if presented as treatment. That realization fascinated him immediately. Inside Arkham, fear already existed naturally. Patients arrived emotionally broken, traumatized, paranoid, violent, addicted, or disconnected from reality itself. Many had no families left willing to fight for them. Others were considered too dangerous for society to trust. Public attention rarely focused on the details of their treatment because Gotham largely preferred not to think about what happened behind Arkham's walls. As long as unstable people remained locked away from the city outside, most citizens stopped asking questions, and that silence created opportunity. By now, Strange's reputation as a brilliant psychiatrist had granted him increasing authority within Gotham's psychiatric world, and Arkham welcomed minds like his, because institutions under constant pressure often confuse intelligence with trustworthiness. Administrators admired his confidence. Staff respected his knowledge. Officials believed he possessed unusual insight into criminal psychology and emotional instability. To many people around him, Hugo Strange appeared exactly like the kind of specialist Arkham needed. Calm, educated, professional, but beneath that polished appearance, his ambitions had already grown far darker than anyone fully understood. Arkham became the perfect environment for those ambitions, because authority inside the asylum operated differently from the outside world. A doctor's words carried enormous weight. Diagnoses shaped reality. Evaluations determined freedom or confinement. Medical records influenced legal systems, security protocols, and public perception. Patients could be isolated, medicated, restrained, or psychologically pressured under the language of treatment, often with very little outside oversight, capable of challenging those decisions effectively. Strange recognized this almost immediately. Medical authority, he realized, could become one of the most powerful forms of control imaginable, because people instinctively trusted professionals, claiming to heal rather than harm. A violent criminal frightened society openly. A respected psychiatrist could manipulate minds quietly while appearing compassionate on the surface. That distinction mattered deeply to him. Within Arkham, Strange began expanding his psychological methods far beyond anything he had attempted previously. Sessions with patients became increasingly invasive emotionally. He pushed conversations toward trauma, shame, fear, and hidden memory with relentless precision, while maintaining an outward appearance of calm, therapeutic professionalism. Many patients entered his office already emotionally fragile, and Strange understood exactly how to guide vulnerable minds toward confusion, dependency, or breakdown without leaving visible evidence of direct abuse. To outsiders, these sessions often looked ordinary: a doctor speaking softly across a table, questions asked carefully, notes written neatly onto files. But for the people trapped inside those conversations, the experience often became something far more disturbing. Strange knew how to identify emotional fractures almost immediately. A patient afraid of abandonment would be isolated emotionally until panic surfaced. Someone burdened by guilt would face carefully repeated suggestion designed to magnify self-hatred. Individuals already struggling with unstable identity found themselves pushed toward uncertainty until they no longer trusted their own thoughts clearly anymore. And because all of this happened under psychiatric supervision, many victims began believing the damage happening to them was part of their own illness rather than manipulation. That was what made Strange so terrifying within Arkham. He rarely needed physical violence. Authority itself became his weapon. Files became weapons too. Over time, Strange developed an enormous fascination with psychiatric records, not merely as medical documents, but as maps of human vulnerability. Every patient file contained hidden fears, traumatic memories, behavioral triggers, emotional weaknesses, family histories, insecurities, and psychological pressure points waiting to be exploited by someone willing to use that information cruelly enough. Most doctors treated confidential records with ethical responsibility. Strange treated them like access keys. He spent countless hours reviewing private histories beneath weak office lighting late into the night while rain struck Arkham's windows outside. Some patients suffered childhood abuse. Others carried grief so deep it reshaped their personalities completely. Certain individuals feared isolation more than death itself. Strange studied these details obsessively because understanding emotional weakness meant understanding control. The more he learned, the less human his patients became in his eyes. They transformed into systems, patterns, behavioral structures, waiting to be dismantled and reconstructed. There were patients who entered Arkham frightened but emotionally stable enough to recover eventually, only to leave psychologically shattered after prolonged exposure to Strange's methods. Some became paranoid and emotionally dependent. Others withdrew into silence after repeated sessions, left them unable to separate their own thoughts from the psychological pressure applied against them. Certain patients suffered breakdowns, not because their original conditions worsened naturally, but because Strange intentionally destabilized them to observe the results. And still, he remained respected. That was the horror hidden inside Arkham's structure. Abuse disguised as treatment often looked invisible from the outside. A patient claiming manipulation could easily be dismissed as unstable. Emotional collapse became interpreted as illness progression, rather than evidence of psychological torture. Strange understood this deeply and used it constantly. The institution itself protected him because Arkham already expected damaged minds, emotional instability, and conflicting versions of reality within its walls. In many ways, Arkham reflected Strange's worldview perfectly. The asylum operated through isolation, surveillance, diagnosis, and control. Human beings were categorized, evaluated, restrained, and studied continuously. Identity inside Arkham often became reduced to symptoms and case numbers rather than individuality. Fear shaped behavior everywhere within the building, whether openly acknowledged or not. And Strange believed fear revealed truth. The deeper he embedded himself within Arkham, the more the institution seemed to transform around his philosophy. Therapy sessions increasingly resembled interrogations. Emotional vulnerability became something to exploit rather than heal. Certain treatment methods focused less on recovery and more on exposure, pressure, and psychological destabilization. Patients often emerged from evaluations emotionally exhausted, carrying the feeling that private parts of themselves had been forced open against their will. Some staff members quietly feared Strange, despite respecting him professionally. There was something deeply unsettling about his calmness, especially during moments involving severe emotional distress. While other doctors reacted with visible concern when patients suffered breakdowns, Strange often appeared fascinated instead, watching closely with analytical concentration, as though observing an experiment unfold successfully. Even Arkham's architecture seemed to strengthen his thinking over time. Long corridors lined with locked doors, observation windows allowing constant surveillance, padded isolation rooms where time itself felt uncertain, security systems separating people from ordinary human contact. The institution blurred the line between treatment and imprisonment so completely that many patients eventually stopped knowing whether they were being helped or controlled. Strange thrived inside that uncertainty. At times, Arkham no longer felt like a hospital at all under his influence. It became something colder, something emotionally mechanical, where vulnerable minds existed beneath endless observation and manipulation. Patients whispered fears about certain doctors behind closed doors. Some avoided eye contact during evaluations. Others became terrified whenever called unexpectedly for private sessions. Yet public perception rarely changed. Outside, Gotham still viewed Arkham as necessary, a place protecting society from dangerous minds. Few realized how easily dangerous minds could rise into positions of authority within the institution itself. And perhaps nobody represented that danger more completely than Hugo Strange. The asylum slowly became more than his workplace. It became a reflection of his inner beliefs about humanity. He viewed people as fragile systems requiring control. Arkham controlled people through locked doors, medication, surveillance, and psychological authority. He believed fear exposed truth. Arkham surrounded its patients with fear constantly. He believed identity could be stripped apart under enough emotional pressure. Arkham removed names, routines, freedom, and certainty from people every single day. The institution and the man began mirroring each other, cold, observant, emotionally detached, filled with hidden suffering behind professional structure. Late at night, when most of Gotham slept beneath drifting fog and distant sirens, Arkham remained awake in its own strange way. Lights hummed softly above silent hallways, while restrained patients stared at ceilings unable to rest. Nurses moved quietly between locked sections, carrying medication trays. Somewhere behind reinforced doors, frightened voices echoed faintly through the darkness. And often, in an office surrounded by psychiatric files stacked high across metal desks, Hugo Strange sat alone, reading through the private fears of broken minds with endless fascination, searching for weaknesses, patterns, and hidden truths buried beneath human identity. To Gotham, Arkham Asylum was meant to contain madness. To Hugo Strange, it became the perfect place to cultivate it. The man who learned Batman's secret. By the time Hugo Strange had fully settled into the dark rhythm of Arkham Asylum, his fascination with Batman had already grown beyond professional curiosity and entered something far more personal, far more consuming, because Batman represented the one mind in Gotham that continued resisting complete understanding. Criminals eventually revealed patterns. Patients eventually exposed weaknesses. Politicians eventually betrayed hidden fears. But Batman remained hidden behind layers so carefully constructed that even years of observation had only revealed fragments of the truth underneath. And Hugo Strange hated fragments. He wanted total understanding. The obsession deepened slowly, almost like a second life unfolding beneath his professional responsibilities. While Arkham's patients slept uneasily behind reinforced doors, and exhausted staff moved through dim hallways beneath flickering light, Strange often remained awake in isolated office rooms, surrounded by photographs, surveillance reports, police documents, witness statements, and handwritten behavioral analyses connected to Batman's sightings across Gotham. Entire walls became covered with timelines, psychological notes, and observations written in precise detail. Every movement mattered. Every decision carried meaning. To most investigators, Batman's identity appeared impossible to uncover because the mask concealed physical appearance and public evidence remained limited. But Strange was no longer searching only for physical clues. He approached the mystery psychologically, believing identity could be exposed through behavior long before faces or fingerprints became necessary. He studied Batman the way astronomers studied distant stars, patiently gathering small pieces of information until larger patterns slowly emerged from the darkness. The first thing Strange noticed was consistency. Batman's methods rarely changed emotionally, even when circumstances became dangerous or chaotic. He controlled environments carefully during confrontations. He preferred psychological intimidation over reckless violence. He targeted corruption obsessively. He displayed extraordinary discipline despite operating under constant pressure. To Strange, these were not random personality traits. They pointed towards someone shaped by long-term emotional structure and severe internal control. The second thing he noticed was pain. Not visible pain in the ordinary sense, but hidden emotional pain woven deeply into Batman's entire existence. Strange became increasingly convinced that Batman's identity had not been created through ambition or ideology alone. It felt personal, intimate, almost ritualistic. The costume, the secrecy, the relentless nightly patrols, the refusal to stop despite physical danger, all of it suggested unresolved trauma transformed into purpose. And somewhere beneath all that trauma, Strange believed a frightened child still existed. That thought fascinated him endlessly. He began reviewing Gotham's history differently, searching not for criminals who could become Batman, but for lives shaped by catastrophic emotional loss, severe enough to create someone willing to dedicate themselves entirely to fear, discipline, and isolation. Wealth narrowed the possibilities quickly. Batman's equipment, technology, mobility, and operational freedom required enormous resources. Physical training narrowed them further, psychological profile narrowed them further still. And slowly, piece by piece, the image began forming. There was one name Strange returned to repeatedly: Bruce Wayne. At first, the connection appeared almost absurd on the surface. Publicly, Bruce Wayne projected carelessness, charm, and emotional detachment from serious responsibility. Gotham newspapers often described him as a wealthy social figure, drifting through parties, charity events, and public appearances with effortless confidence. To ordinary observers, he seemed too relaxed, too publicly visible, too emotionally unserious to possibly be the terrifying figure haunting Gotham's rooftops at night. But Hugo Strange did not trust surfaces. He trusted patterns, and certain patterns surrounding Bruce Wayne began disturbing him deeply. The trauma fit perfectly. A child witnessing the murder of both parents in front of him. Public grief buried beneath years of emotional isolation, sudden withdrawal from ordinary social development, obsessive travel and training during adulthood, enormous financial resources combined with increasing secrecy. Strange reviewed every available psychological detail connected to Bruce Wayne's life and felt something cold settle quietly inside his thoughts. The mask was not hiding Batman from Gotham. The public identity was hiding Bruce Wayne from himself. That realization changed everything. For days afterward, Strange barely slept. He reviewed evidence repeatedly, searching for flaws in the conclusion. But the more he examined behavioral details, the more impossible it became to ignore. Batman's psychology aligned with Bruce Wayne's trauma too completely. The emotional structure matched perfectly: fear of loss, obsessive control, isolation disguised as discipline, symbolic transformation built from childhood terror. Strange understood it now, or at least he believed he did. The moment itself brought him no satisfaction in the ordinary sense. There was no excitement, like a detective solving a puzzle, no triumph, no relief. Instead, the discovery created something far more dangerous inside him: intimacy. Because now Batman no longer felt like a distant mystery moving through Gotham's darkness. He became emotionally accessible in Strange's mind, a damaged human being with identifiable wounds, hidden compulsions, and psychological structures waiting to be explored completely. And that made the obsession worse than ever before. The truth did not end Strange's fascination. It fed it. Bruce Wayne's public identity fascinated him almost as much as Batman itself now. Strange became obsessed with the contrast between the two personas, studying how Bruce Wayne performed normalcy while secretly carrying enormous unresolved pain beneath the surface. To Strange, Bruce Wayne's public behavior looked artificial, carefully constructed to distract attention from the emotional machinery operating underneath. He began viewing every public appearance differently. Every smile looked rehearsed. Every joke looked defensive. Every careless gesture looked intentional. The deeper Strange examined Bruce Wayne psychologically, the more convinced he became that Batman represented the true self, hidden beneath years of emotional performance. In his mind, Bruce Wayne was not the real identity at all. Bruce Wayne was camouflage. Batman was the honest expression of trauma, fear, rage, and obsessive purpose buried underneath. This belief consumed him. At times, Strange felt almost euphoric while reviewing his conclusions privately because he believed he had achieved something nobody else in Gotham could accomplish. Criminals feared Batman physically. Police hunted him legally. Journalists speculated endlessly about his identity. But Hugo Strange believed he had done something far more profound. He believed he understood Batman emotionally. And once he accepted that idea fully, a terrifying arrogance began growing stronger inside him. Strange started viewing himself as uniquely connected to Batman's hidden reality, almost like a psychiatrist who had diagnosed a patient no one else could properly interpret. In his mind, he now saw through both masks simultaneously. He understood the frightened child hidden beneath the billionaire facade. He understood the compulsive discipline hidden beneath the symbol of fear. At least, he believed he did. This belief created a strange emotional intoxication that slowly distorted Strange's thinking even further. He no longer wanted merely to expose Batman publicly or defeat him physically. Those goals felt small compared to what now fascinated him most: the idea of psychologically dismantling Bruce Wayne completely and proving that he understood Batman's mind better than Batman himself ever could. That thought became addictive, because if Strange truly understood Batman more deeply than Batman understood himself, then perhaps he had achieved something greater than intellectual victory. Perhaps he had gained emotional authority over Gotham's most powerful symbol. The idea thrilled him. Late at night, while pale moonlight drifted through Arkham's narrow windows and distant thunder rolled across Gotham's skyline, Strange often sat alone, replaying imagined psychological conversations between himself and Bruce Wayne. He imagined peeling away defenses carefully, exposing hidden guilt, unresolved grief, suppressed fear, and emotional exhaustion buried beneath years of control. He imagined Batman finally being seen completely, not admired, not feared, dissected. This was the difference between strange and ordinary enemies. Most people wanted to stop Batman. Strange wanted to open him psychologically. The obsession became so powerful that even Batman's victories fascinated Strange rather than frustrating him. Every act of discipline reinforced his theories. Every emotional sacrifice confirmed deeper trauma. Every refusal to abandon the mission strengthened Strange's belief that Bruce Wayne no longer understood where the mask ended and the damaged child beneath it truly began. And perhaps, most dangerously of all, Strange began believing he could eventually guide Batman towards psychological collapse simply by understanding him deeply enough. Because in Strange's worldview, no mind remained invulnerable forever. Everyone possessed hidden fractures, everyone carried emotional wounds, and once those wounds became visible, control eventually followed. There were moments when Strange almost seemed to admire Bruce Wayne genuinely, though the admiration remained twisted by obsession and superiority. He respected Batman's discipline, intelligence, and psychological precision. He even recognized aspects of himself reflected within Batman's methods. The emotional isolation, the obsessive focus, the understanding of fear as a weapon. But where Batman used fear to protect Gotham, Strange used fear to dominate vulnerable minds. And somewhere inside that contrast, Strange convinced himself that Batman was simply a less honest version of what he already was. That belief became one of the most dangerous illusions of his life. Because now, every interaction, every investigation, every thought surrounding Batman carried a disturbing sense of personal connection. Strange no longer viewed himself as an outsider, observing Gotham's dark protector from afar. He viewed himself as the only person intelligent enough to truly comprehend the psychological reality hidden underneath the symbol. The more he believed this, the more emotionally attached he became to the obsession. And like all obsessions built from arrogance and emotional projection, it slowly began pulling him deeper into something unstable. Far below Gotham's towering buildings, inside silent office rooms filled with psychiatric files and scattered photographs connected by endless handwritten notes, Hugo Strange often stared for long periods at images of Bruce Wayne and Batman placed side by side beneath weak artificial light, studying the same face hidden beneath two different lives. Most people would have felt shock discovering such a secret. Some might have felt fear, others might have seen opportunity, but Hugo Strange felt something far more dangerous. He felt understanding, or at least the intoxicating illusion of it, becoming Batman. Once Hugo Strange convinced himself that he understood Batman better than anyone else in Gotham, something inside him began changing in ways even he could no longer fully recognize. Because obsession rarely stays still for long. At first, it begins with observation. Then curiosity deepens into emotional fixation. Eventually, if left unchecked, the distance between studying someone and becoming consumed by them starts disappearing completely, until identity itself begins bending around the object of obsession like metal, slowly warping beneath enormous heat. For Strange, that transformation happened quietly. No dramatic announcement marked the beginning. No sudden breakdown exposed it publicly. Instead, there was simply a growing shift in his thoughts, habits, and behavior, small enough at first that even he might not have fully understood what was happening. He still told himself he was studying Batman clinically, analyzing the psychology behind Gotham's most feared symbol with detached intellectual precision. But beneath that explanation, another impulse had already started growing stronger. He no longer wanted merely to understand Batman. He wanted to experience what Batman experienced. That desire frightened him slightly at first, though he would never openly admit such a thing even to himself. The idea felt irrational, almost embarrassing for someone who prided himself on emotional control and scientific thinking. Yet once the thought entered his mind, it became impossible to fully remove. Strange had spent so many years examining Batman's psychological structure that the identity itself now occupied enormous space inside his own thoughts. He began imagining Gotham through Batman's perspective. What did fear feel like when used deliberately as a weapon? What happened emotionally when an entire city reacted to your presence like a living myth? How much control did Batman feel while standing above terrified criminals hidden in darkness? These questions no longer sounded academic in Strange's mind. They sounded personal. Soon, subtle imitation began appearing throughout his daily life. Strange adjusted his routines without consciously acknowledging why. He became more physically disciplined, spending increasing amounts of time strengthening his body, despite never previously caring deeply about physical conditioning. He altered sleep schedules, trained himself to function longer under exhaustion, and pushed his endurance further than necessary, simply because Batman's existence seemed built upon relentless discipline. The changes were not only physical. Emotionally, Strange started modeling aspects of his behavior around Batman's methods as well. He spoke less during certain interactions, allowing silence to create tension naturally. He moved through Arkham's hallways with colder control than before, carefully observing how fear altered behavior among patients and staff alike. He became increasingly fascinated by theatrical psychological presence, the ability to dominate environments emotionally before speaking a single word. To Strange, this proved something important. Batman's true power did not come from morality. It came from psychological dominance. This belief slowly became central to his thinking. Gotham often described Batman as a hero, but Strange rejected that interpretation completely. Heroes inspired hope. Batman inspired fear. Criminals changed behavior because they feared him emotionally, not because they admired ethical principles. Strange believed Gotham misunderstood Batman entirely by focusing on morality instead of psychological influence. In his mind, Batman had achieved control through terror, and if fear created control, then perhaps morality had never mattered at all. This idea obsessed him endlessly because it seemed to validate his own worldview. Strange had always believed human beings responded more honestly to fear than compassion. Batman appeared to prove that theory nightly across Gotham's streets and rooftops. Criminals obeyed because they feared consequences. Citizens whispered stories because fear amplified myth. Even the police operated differently, knowing Batman existed somewhere beyond ordinary rules. To Strange, Batman's success became evidence that psychological pressure shaped human behavior more effectively than ethical persuasion ever could. And if that was true, then perhaps Strange himself had been closer to Batman all along than anyone realized. This belief marked the beginning of something deeply disturbing. The line separating admiration from imitation slowly vanished. Strange started studying Batman's physical movements obsessively, reviewing surveillance footage frame by frame whenever possible. He analyzed posture, timing, breathing patterns, and methods of intimidation with the concentration of someone no longer satisfied with theory alone. He experimented privately with vocal tone, emotional stillness, and controlled body language designed to project authority through fear rather than open aggression. There were even moments when staff inside Arkham quietly noticed subtle differences in Strange's behavior without understanding the cause. He carried himself differently now, with colder precision and heavier silence. Conversations became more calculated. Eye contact lingered longer. Certain employees later described feeling strangely intimidated in his presence despite no obvious threat being made. But the most frightening changes happened privately. Alone inside, locked office spaces late at night, surrounded by files, photographs, and endless psychological notes about Batman and Bruce Wayne, Strange began rehearsing imagined scenarios where he placed himself psychologically into Batman's role. He studied the symbolism carefully, the isolation, the fear, the obsessive discipline. And over time, he stopped viewing those traits as belonging only to Batman. He began absorbing them into himself. The obsession grew so intense that certain boundaries inside his own identity started weakening. Strange increasingly referred to Batman not as a separate person to study, but almost as an extension of psychological truths he already believed about humanity. He convinced himself that Batman's methods succeeded because they reflected deeper realities. Ordinary people feared, acknowledging openly. Fear controlled behavior. Trauma created transformation. Isolation sharpened purpose. The city responded not to goodness, but to power wrapped in myth. Strange repeated these ideas constantly until Batman no longer felt like an individual in his mind. Batman became philosophy, symbol, psychological architecture, and eventually, Strange wanted ownership over that architecture himself. This was where the obsession turned truly dangerous. He no longer viewed Batman merely as someone worthy of analysis. He started believing Batman's identity could be improved, corrected, even perfected through his own understanding. In Strange's mind, Bruce Wayne remained emotionally limited because guilt and morality restrained him unnecessarily. Batman used fear effectively, yes, but still clung to ethical lines preventing complete psychological dominance. Strange believed he could become a more evolved version, a purer version, a Batman without hesitation. That thought slowly poisoned what remained of his individuality. As weeks passed, Strange spent increasing time imagining himself operating beneath Gotham's darkness, not as Hugo Strange observing Batman, but as the figure Gotham feared itself. He envisioned criminals collapsing psychologically beneath carefully constructed terror. He imagined absolute emotional control over environments. He imagined stripping Gotham's hidden corruption into the open through fear powerful enough to crush resistance completely. The frightening thing was how logical all of this sounded inside his own mind. Obsession had reshaped his thinking so deeply that he no longer recognized the psychological collapse unfolding inside himself. He interpreted growing identity confusion as enlightenment rather than instability. To him, becoming psychologically closer to Batman represented progress, proof that he understood Gotham's deeper emotional structure more completely than anyone else alive. But beneath that illusion, something tragic was happening quietly. Hugo Strange himself was beginning to disappear. The more he obsessed over Batman's identity, the less stable his own became. Personal habits changed, emotional responses changed. Even private thoughts increasingly revolved around Batman's worldview, Batman's methods, Batman's symbolism. Strange no longer studied Batman from outside the psychological structure. He had entered it emotionally, and once inside, he could no longer separate himself clearly anymore. There were moments when he stared into mirrors for long periods, without fully understanding why the reflection unsettled him slightly. The face remained his own, calm and professional as always, yet internally something felt displaced. Batman occupied too much space inside his thoughts now. The symbol had stopped being external. It had moved inward. This is one of the most terrifying aspects of obsession, especially for minds already detached from healthy emotional grounding. Obsession does not always destroy identity violently. Sometimes it erodes it slowly, replacing original thoughts and desires piece by piece until the person no longer notices how much has been lost. And Hugo Strange had already lost more than he realized. His work inside Arkham grew colder during this period. Patients increasingly became mirrors through which he tested theories about fear, submission, and psychological transformation connected to Batman's methods. Certain sessions resembled rehearsals for emotional domination rather than therapy. Strange studied how silence intimidated vulnerable minds. He experimented with controlled appearances and theatrical tension. Even ordinary interactions became opportunities to imitate the emotional impact Batman created throughout Gotham. Only now, without morality guiding those methods, the results became far darker. Because Batman used fear to protect, Strange used fear to consume. The distinction mattered more than Strange understood. Yet by now, he genuinely believed he had transcended ordinary psychological limitations. Discovering Bruce Wayne's secret identity had not grounded him in reality. It had destabilized him further by convincing him that understanding Batman psychologically granted him ownership over Batman's meaning. He no longer wanted merely to expose Batman. He wanted to replace him emotionally within Gotham's mythology. Late at night, when the city disappeared beneath drifting fog and weak moonlight reflected across silent skyscraper windows, Strange sometimes stood alone in darkness, imagining himself above Gotham's streets, not as doctor, researcher, or observer anymore, but as something transformed entirely through fear and psychological control. And somewhere within those moments, the line between Hugo Strange and the identity consuming him grew thinner and thinner, until even he no longer seemed fully certain where one ended and the other began. The manipulation of Gotham's elite. Gotham had always been a city built on secrets. Behind the glowing windows of expensive towers and beneath the polished floors of grand banquet halls, fear moved quietly through conversations hidden behind smiles and carefully chosen words. Wealthy politicians shook hands while hiding corruption deep inside private accounts. Business leaders funded charities during the day and criminal operations during the night. Influential social figures attended elegant parties while protecting scandals capable of destroying entire reputations if exposed publicly. Gotham survived through appearances, and because appearances mattered so deeply, the city's most powerful people spent enormous energy protecting the versions of themselves they wanted others to see. Hugo Strange understood this better than almost anyone. By now, his years inside Arkham Asylum and Gotham's psychiatric world had given him access to something far more valuable than money or weapons. He possessed information. Not ordinary information gathered from newspapers or police reports, but deeply personal knowledge pulled from emotional breakdowns, confidential evaluations, hidden addictions, suppressed trauma, secret fears, and vulnerable moments powerful people never imagined would someday become dangerous. Because what Gotham's elite failed to understand was that every private confession eventually became ammunition in the hands of someone like Hugo Strange. And unlike criminals who ruled through violence or intimidation openly, Strange preferred quieter methods. He had already learned that knowledge could cut deeper than physical force if used correctly. A bullet frightened people temporarily. Exposure destroyed entire lives. Fear of public humiliation, scandal, emotional weakness, or hidden truth often controlled human behavior more effectively than pain ever could. This realization transformed the way Strange operated throughout Gotham. He no longer limited himself to manipulating patients or psychologically vulnerable individuals inside institutions. His attention expanded toward the city's wealthy and influential figures, the people who believed power protected them from emotional exposure. Politicians, judges, executives, socialites, corrupt officials, criminal financiers, and respected public figures slowly entered Strange's orbit through professional connections, psychiatric consultations, private events, and confidential evaluations. Many of them trusted him immediately. That was part of the horror. Hugo Strange looked safe. He carried himself with calm professionalism. His speech remained measured and intelligent. He rarely displayed open aggression. Wealthy Gotham families viewed him as a respected psychiatrist with extraordinary insight into human behavior. Some approached him privately seeking advice about emotionally unstable relatives, personal anxiety, addiction, stress, or political pressure. Others simply enjoyed speaking with someone whose intelligence seemed refined and controlled. Very few realized they were placing their deepest fears into the hands of someone who viewed vulnerability as opportunity. Strange listened carefully during every interaction, always searching beneath surface conversation for emotional fractures hidden underneath. He noticed insecurity, disguised as arrogance. He recognized shame hidden beneath confidence. He identified desperation concealed behind polished public appearances. To him, Gotham's elite often resembled frightened children trapped inside adult power structures. endlessly terrified of exposure while pretending complete control. And once Strange understood what someone feared most, he could control them with terrifying precision. This was where his blackmail schemes began evolving into something far more sophisticated than ordinary criminal extortion. Strange rarely relied on crude threats. Instead, he weaponized psychological understanding itself. He understood that most powerful people feared emotional destruction more than physical harm. Public disgrace, exposure of secret desires, loss of status, collapse of carefully constructed identity. These fears often ruled Gotham's elite more completely than laws or morality ever could. Strange used that knowledge masterfully. A corrupt official might receive anonymous information proving someone knew about hidden financial crimes. A wealthy businessman battling private addiction could suddenly realize confidential treatment records no longer felt secure. A respected social figure hiding emotional instability might begin noticing subtle reminders that their secrets were visible to someone watching closely. The terrifying thing was how indirect Strange often remained. He rarely needed explicit threats. A carefully timed comment during conversation, a private document appearing where it should not exist, a subtle reference to a hidden fear no stranger should possibly know. These small psychological pressures created enormous emotional panic because powerful people spent their lives protecting carefully constructed public identities. Strange understood this deeply and exploited it with endless patience. In many ways, Gotham's wealthy class became one of his greatest studies. He discovered that power rarely removed fear, it simply changed what people feared losing. Poor citizens feared survival. Gotham's elite feared collapse of image, influence, control, and reputation. Strange viewed these fears almost scientifically, cataloging emotional weaknesses the way researchers cataloged symptoms of disease. Some feared scandal, others feared abandonment, some feared irrelevance, others feared exposure of desires they spent entire lives hiding. And Strange could sense these vulnerabilities with frightening accuracy. At formal gatherings beneath glittering chandeliers where Gotham's upper class drank expensive wine and discussed politics with carefully practiced confidence, Strange often moved quietly through conversations, observing emotional behavior invisible to almost everyone else in the room. He noticed trembling hands hidden beneath polished manners, forced laughter masking anxiety, married couples unable to make eye contact naturally, corrupt officials constantly monitoring social reactions around them out of paranoia. To most observers, these events represented wealth and power. To Hugo Strange, they resembled psychological hunting grounds. His greatest strength was never physical intimidation, it was emotional exposure. He understood that human beings often destroyed themselves once forced to confront hidden fears publicly. Violence created resistance. Knowledge created submission because people willingly surrendered when terrified their secrets might escape into the world around them. This made Strange uniquely dangerous within Gotham's social structure. Gangsters threatened lives openly. Strange threatened identity itself. There were wealthy figures who quietly obeyed requests from unknown sources because they feared what Hugo Strange knew about them privately. Some redirected political decisions. Others provided access, funding, or protection simply to prevent emotional ruin. Strange rarely appeared connected directly to these manipulations because he preferred distance. Fear worked more effectively when uncertainty remained unresolved. Victims often never fully understood how much he knew, and that uncertainty poisoned them psychologically. Certain officials became paranoid over time, constantly wondering whether private conversations had somehow reached Strange's ears. Some individuals avoided seeking psychiatric treatment entirely because rumors about confidentiality surrounding Strange quietly spread through elite Gotham circles. Yet despite growing unease, many continued trusting him anyway because intelligence and professionalism created powerful illusions of safety. That contradiction fascinated Strange endlessly. People feared him emotionally while still respecting him publicly. To him, This proved something important about human nature. Most people preferred comforting appearances over uncomfortable truth, even when danger stood directly in front of them. Gotham's elite especially lived inside carefully maintained illusions. They wanted to believe education guaranteed morality. They wanted to believe institutions protected them. They wanted to believe respected professionals operated ethically. Hugo Strange shattered those assumptions quietly from within. The deeper his schemes expanded, the more he realized that nearly everyone in Gotham carried hidden terror beneath the surface. Even the city's most powerful individuals often built their lives around avoiding emotional exposure. Strange could see it constantly now. Fear-shaped behavior everywhere. A politician desperate to protect reputation. A judge terrified private corruption might surface publicly. A wealthy heir afraid emotional instability ran through the family bloodline. A criminal financier secretly terrified of dying forgotten and powerless. Strange understood these fears with almost supernatural clarity because he had spent years studying emotional weakness across every level of Gotham society. To him, fear connected all human beings, regardless of wealth or status. And once fear became visible, control followed naturally. This belief strengthened his growing arrogance enormously. Strange no longer viewed himself as merely intelligent. He believed he possessed deeper understanding of humanity itself than almost anyone alive. Gotham's elite reinforced this illusion constantly because so many powerful people unknowingly surrendered emotional power to him through private confessions, psychiatric consultations, and hidden vulnerabilities. Knowledge became his true addiction. Not money, not fame, not even direct control. Knowledge itself intoxicated him because information revealed hidden emotional reality beneath social performance. Every secret uncovered made him feel elevated above ordinary human limitation. Every weakness exposed strengthened his belief that people were ultimately predictable once stripped of comfort and illusion. And unlike physical weapons, knowledge rarely left visible evidence. That was why Strange preferred it. A destroyed reputation could not heal easily. Emotional panic lingered far longer than bruises. Fear of exposure transformed behavior continuously, even without direct confrontation. Strange understood psychological pressure so deeply by now that he could manipulate entire situations through carefully placed information alone. Sometimes he barely needed to act at all. A person frightened enough by what might happen often destroyed themselves emotionally before direct force ever became necessary. This was the hidden horror surrounding Hugo Strange throughout Gotham. Most dangerous figures announced themselves loudly through violence and chaos. Strange operated quietly through private understanding. He could sit calmly across from someone during dinner conversation, while already knowing exactly which hidden fear controlled their life completely. And the terrifying part was how much he enjoyed that feeling, not emotionally in the ordinary sense, but intellectually. Each exposed weakness confirmed his worldview. Human beings remained fragile beneath social identity. Fear shaped everything. Power protected nothing internally. Gotham's elite, despite all their money and influence, still carried terrified minds beneath expensive clothing and practiced confidence. Late at night, while the city glowed beneath cold rain and distant traffic moved like restless shadows through narrow streets below, Strange often reviewed confidential records and private observations alone in silence, studying Gotham's most influential people with endless concentration. To ordinary citizens, those figures represented authority. To Hugo Strange, they represented collections of secrets waiting patiently to be used. Because in the end, his greatest weapon had never been chemicals, physical force, or even fear itself. It had always been understanding exactly what people wanted hidden from the world most desperately, and knowing how easily that hidden truth could bring them to their knees. Protocols, files, and hidden rooms. Long before most people in Gotham understood how deeply Hugo Strange had buried himself inside the city's hidden systems, there were already entire sections of his work existing beyond public view. Rooms and corridors tucked beneath institutional buildings, concealed behind security doors, false walls, and forgotten service tunnels, where records were stored not simply as medical information, but as emotional maps of human vulnerability. These places rarely appeared on official blueprints. Some existed beneath Arkham City's lower structures. Others were hidden inside abandoned medical facilities, no longer listed in active use. A few were built quietly into unused wings of psychiatric institutions, where access remained restricted even to senior staff. To outsiders, they would have looked ordinary at first glance. Metal cabinets, old concrete walls, dim fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, computer monitors glowing in otherwise silent rooms. But once someone looked closer, the true horror slowly revealed itself. Because these were not normal archives, they were collections of fear. Thousands of files filled the hidden rooms, each one documenting deeply personal, emotional details gathered through years of surveillance, psychological evaluation, private interviews, manipulated therapy sessions, and unauthorized observation. Strange had spent enormous portions of his life recording the inner damage of other human beings with terrifying precision. Childhood trauma, addictions, secret compulsions, recurring nightmares, sexual shame, panic triggers, emotional dependencies, fear of abandonment, violent fantasies, never spoken aloud publicly. Nothing felt too private for his records. And what made the entire system especially disturbing was the emotional distance with which he created it all. Strange did not behave like someone emotionally obsessed with individual victims in the ordinary sense. He approached the archives with cold fascination, almost like a scientist cataloging rare diseases beneath glass containers. Every fear became data. Every painful memory became behavioral material. Every emotional collapse became another document, carefully organized into endless psychological systems only he fully understood. The files themselves reflected his worldview completely. Some records stretched hundreds of pages long, containing years of observations gathered from surveillance footage, confidential interviews, hidden recordings, and manipulated emotional interactions. Strange often divided subjects into categories based on dominant psychological vulnerabilities: fear of humiliation, fear of death, fear of irrelevance, fear of isolation. He believed every human being possessed one central emotional weakness, powerful enough to control the rest of their behavior if identified correctly. And he dedicated enormous portions of his life to finding those weaknesses. The deeper someone entered Strange's archives, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. Certain rooms contained shelves lined with photographs marked by handwritten notes describing emotional reactions observed during specific moments of stress or fear. Other sections stored recordings of therapy sessions where vulnerable individuals unknowingly revealed traumatic experiences, while Strange listened with detached concentration from behind calm professional language. There were even hidden protocols attached to many files. Specific psychological approaches designed for manipulation, recommended phrases capable of triggering emotional instability, isolation methods, behavioral pressure sequences, environmental stress tactics. To Strange, these were not cruel inventions. They were tools. This way of thinking transformed the hidden rooms into something far darker than ordinary laboratories or archives. They became physical representations of his belief that human beings existed as systems capable of being controlled once their emotional structures were understood deeply enough. And nowhere was that belief more visible than in the way he documented trauma itself. Most therapists approach trauma carefully, understanding that painful memories carried enormous emotional weight, requiring compassion and trust. Hugo Strange approached trauma like a lock waiting to be opened. He studied suffering with endless focus because pain often revealed the deepest truths about identity. A person's greatest fear usually connected directly to the emotional wound they spent their entire life trying to escape. Strange wanted access to those wounds, constantly. He often recorded not only what people feared, but how they reacted physically while discussing fear. Breathing changes, eye movement, hand tension, speech hesitation. He believed the body revealed emotional truth, even when words attempted concealment. Every detail mattered to him because every detail increased control. Over time, the hidden facilities became more technologically advanced as surveillance systems expanded throughout Gotham and Arkham City. Secret observation rooms allowed uninterrupted monitoring of selected subjects for long periods without their awareness. Some areas contained walls lined with active screens, displaying live behavioral footage from different institutional sections simultaneously. Strange could sit silently for hours, studying movement patterns, emotional reactions, social behavior, and psychological deterioration unfolding across multiple environments at once. The atmosphere inside these rooms carried constant tension. Soft electrical humming filled the silence. Monitor light reflected against cold metal surfaces. File drawers opened and closed quietly beneath fluorescent glare. Everywhere, there was the feeling of unseen observation, of lives being watched too closely, of privacy dissolving slowly without consent. And perhaps that was what made Hugo Strange truly terrifying more than anything else. Violence often announces itself clearly, but Strange created emotional exposure so intimate that victims sometimes felt psychologically stripped apart before realizing they were even under attack. He knew things no stranger should know: a patient's worst childhood memory, a politician's hidden panic attacks, a criminal's fear of dying forgotten, a wealthy social figure's private shame buried beneath years of performance. He gathered these details endlessly, not because he cared emotionally, but because understanding vulnerability made him feel powerful in ways ordinary authority never could. There were moments when even experienced professionals who briefly entered parts of Strange's hidden research systems felt disturbed by the level of detail surrounding certain files. Some records no longer resembled medical documentation at all. They felt invasive, almost predatory, as though the subject's entire emotional life had been opened against their will and reorganized into systems of control. Yet Strange himself viewed this as progress. He believed privacy prevented true understanding. People lied constantly, even to themselves. Only deep observation uncovered reality. This belief justified nearly every violation occurring within the hidden rooms, because, in Strange's mind, emotional exposure revealed truth, while secrecy preserved illusion. His obsession with Batman and Bruce Wayne occupied entire isolated sections within the archives by this point. Detailed psychological profiles covered walls and tables beneath dim lighting. Behavioral analyses stretched across countless pages. Childhood trauma timelines, emotional pattern observations, surveillance records, and handwritten theories about Batman's identity fragmentation filled locked storage systems accessible only to Strange himself. Some files included disturbingly personal conclusions about Bruce Wayne's emotional state during specific public appearances. Strange documented facial expressions, speech rhythm changes, posture adjustments, and moments of visible emotional restraint with obsessive attention. He often wrote as though he possessed direct access to Bruce Wayne's inner thoughts, confidently interpreting hidden psychological meaning behind ordinary gestures. The frightening thing was how intimate these records felt. Not intimate in the sense of affection, but in the sense of violation. Strange's understanding of people reached into emotional spaces no human being should access without trust and consent. Reading his observations would have felt like standing naked beneath endless scrutiny, while someone calmly explained your deepest fears back to you in perfect detail. And Strange loved that feeling of psychological access, because once someone's emotional structure became visible completely, they stopped feeling unpredictable to him. That was what he wanted most: predictability, control. complete psychological exposure. The hidden rooms reflected these desires perfectly. There were sections where recorded interviews played softly through headphones, besides synchronized behavioral notes, documenting emotional stress points in real time. Other chambers stored experimental psychological profiles connected to population control theories developed during Arkham City's operations. Some areas remained so isolated and heavily secured that even trusted personnel never realized they existed beneath the institution around them. Everything inside the system served one purpose: understanding people deeply enough to control them completely. And somewhere along the way, Strange stopped recognizing how horrifying that goal truly was. The deeper his archives expanded, the less human his subjects became in his eyes. He no longer saw individuals carrying pain and fear. He saw structures, weaknesses, emotional architecture. Every private confession transformed into strategic information. Every hidden insecurity became another entry in systems designed for manipulation. At times, the hidden laboratories and archives almost resembled a second version of Gotham itself, one built not from streets and buildings, but from secrets. Thousands of private emotional realities stored beneath locked doors, where Hugo Strange moved silently between shelves and monitors, like the keeper of some enormous, invisible prison constructed entirely from human vulnerability. And because the information remained hidden, the city outside continued functioning normally without understanding how exposed it truly was. Politicians attended public events, unaware that their emotional weaknesses existed inside carefully organized files beneath Gotham's foundations. Patients walked free, never realizing private therapy sessions had been transformed into long-term behavioral studies. Criminals planned violent operations, while their deepest fears sat recorded within Strange's endless archives. The entire city existed beneath observation without fully knowing it. That atmosphere of invisible exposure slowly spread through Strange's thinking until paranoia itself became part of his worldview. He believed observation revealed truth. Therefore, constant observation became necessary. Hidden cameras, secret files, unauthorized recordings, behavioral tracking systems, all of it felt justified because privacy now looked dangerous to him. Privacy allowed unpredictability, and unpredictability threatened control. Late at night, while Gotham disappeared beneath heavy rain and distant sirens echoed faintly through sleeping neighborhoods above, Strange often walked alone through his hidden rooms, surrounded by endless shelves of human fear, preserved carefully in files, recordings, and surveillance reports. Thousands of private lives, thousands of hidden wounds, thousands of emotional weaknesses waiting patiently beneath locked cabinets and glowing monitors. And standing in the middle of it all, Hugo Strange no longer resembled a doctor studying human behavior. He resembled something far colder, a man who believed knowing every vulnerable detail about another person gave him the right to own them emotionally forever. The thin line between doctor and patient. For many years, Hugo Strange believed he stood above the emotional weakness he observed in others, because while patients inside Gotham's institutions trembled beneath fear, paranoia, trauma, addiction, and fractured identity, he remained calm, disciplined, and intellectually controlled, or at least that was the version of himself he protected carefully behind professional language and measured behavior. He spent so much of his life studying broken minds that he slowly convinced himself he could never become one of them. To Strange, mental instability belonged to other people, to criminals screaming inside Arkham cells, to emotionally damaged patients unable to separate reality from obsession, to frightened citizens collapsing beneath Gotham's endless pressure. He never imagined the same collapse could already be happening quietly inside him. That was part of the tragedy and part of the horror, because the most dangerous thing about Hugo Strange was not simply his intelligence or cruelty, but the fact that his deterioration unfolded beneath extraordinary self-confidence. He truly believed he remained rational long after his thinking had become deeply unstable. Every obsession felt logical to him. Every violation felt justified. Every growing distortion inside his mind appeared, in his own eyes, as proof of superior understanding rather than evidence of psychological collapse. This is often how certain forms of madness grow, not through confusion or obvious emotional chaos at first, but through certainty so extreme that the mind loses its ability to question itself honestly anymore. By now, Strange's obsession with Batman had consumed enormous portions of his emotional life. What began as intellectual fascination had transformed into something far more personal and unstable. He thought about Batman constantly. He analyzed him endlessly. He interpreted ordinary events through Batman's psychological framework. Entire sections of his hidden archives revolved around understanding and reconstructing the emotional structure of Bruce Wayne. And yet, despite this overwhelming fixation, Strange still viewed himself as objective. That contradiction revealed how deeply detached he had become from reality. The deeper his obsession grew, the more isolated he became emotionally from ordinary human connection. Strange rarely experienced relationships in healthy ways anymore, because most interactions had become psychological exercises rather than genuine emotional exchanges. He studied people instead of trusting them. He manipulated conversations instead of participating naturally. Every social interaction carried hidden analysis beneath the surface. Over time, this constant emotional distance began affecting his perception of reality itself. He started trusting his interpretations more than observable truth. This was where paranoia slowly entered his thinking. Not the loud paranoia of frightened patients screaming about invisible threats, but a colder and more intellectual form, one hidden beneath logic and professional confidence. Strange increasingly believed very few people around him were capable of understanding the world correctly. Administrators looked weak. Doctors looked emotionally compromised. Gotham's political leaders looked blind. Even Batman, in Strange's mind, remained psychologically limited by unresolved emotional conflict. Only Hugo Strange, he believed, truly saw reality clearly. That belief became dangerous very quickly, because once someone fully convinces themselves they alone understand truth, disagreement no longer feels like ordinary opposition. It begins feeling like proof that others are ignorant, unstable, or intentionally resisting reality itself. Strange slowly started interpreting criticism this way. Questions about his methods became evidence of intellectual weakness in others. Concern about ethics became proof of emotional fragility. Resistance to psychological control became irrational behavior requiring correction. And because he already possessed enormous authority within systems built around mental evaluation, he could project instability onto others while hiding his own increasingly distorted thinking behind medical language and institutional power. This made him terrifying. There were moments when staff members quietly noticed changes in him that felt difficult to explain clearly. Strange became more withdrawn socially. He spent abnormal amounts of time isolated within hidden research areas. His conversations occasionally drifted toward obsessive themes, involving fear, identity, and control, even during unrelated discussions. Certain employees later described the unsettling feeling that Strange no longer reacted emotionally to ordinary human suffering in recognizable ways. Yet because he remained calm externally, most concerns never moved beyond whispers. Calmness often hides deterioration effectively, especially in intelligent people, and Hugo Strange understood psychological presentation so deeply that he could still perform professionalism long after his internal stability had started collapsing. But small cracks continued appearing. Sometimes he spoke about Batman less like an external figure and more like a psychological extension of himself. At other times, he seemed strangely convinced he could predict behavior with near-perfect accuracy, reacting with visible irritation whenever reality failed to match his expectations precisely. His narcissism expanded steadily as well. Strange no longer viewed himself as simply intelligent. He believed he had transcended ordinary emotional limitations entirely. That belief isolated him further from reality every year. Because narcissism often creates a dangerous cycle. where self-image becomes more important than truth itself. Strange could not emotionally tolerate the possibility that he might be wrong, unstable, or psychologically compromised, because his entire identity depended on believing he understood minds better than anyone else alive. So whenever evidence of his deterioration appeared, he projected it outward instead. This was one of the darkest ironies surrounding him. The psychiatrist, diagnosing instability in others, had become unable to recognize his own illness. There were patients inside Arkham whom Strange labeled paranoid despite exhibiting many of the same behaviors himself. He accused others of obsession while dedicating entire hidden archives to Batman. He described emotional delusion in patients, while increasingly believing his own interpretations represented unquestionable truth. In many ways, the qualities he condemned professionally had already rooted themselves deeply inside his own thinking. But unlike ordinary patients, Strange possessed intelligence, authority, and emotional discipline strong enough to hide the deterioration from public view, at least temporarily. The obsession with control worsened everything. Strange's need to understand and manage human behavior eventually expanded into need for dominance over unpredictability itself. Unexpected emotional responses irritated him. Independent thought frustrated him. Resistance felt personally offensive. Over time, he stopped seeing uncertainty as a natural part of human existence and started viewing it as threat requiring elimination. This worldview slowly narrowed his emotional reality. Only control felt safe, only certainty felt acceptable, and because complete certainty is impossible, paranoia inevitably followed. He became increasingly suspicious of hidden resistance around him. Staff conversations felt potentially dangerous. Institutional oversight looked intrusive. Independent actions by others seemed emotionally loaded with hidden motives. Strange trusted almost nobody fully because he increasingly viewed human behavior through systems of manipulation and concealed intention. Ironically, years spent psychologically dissecting others had taught him to see hidden motives everywhere, until eventually he could no longer stop seeing them. This constant suspicion isolated him emotionally even further. Late at night, while Gotham's lights glowed faintly beneath drifting fog beyond reinforced windows, Strange often remained alone for hours, reviewing psychological files and surveillance records in silence. Unable to rest because his thoughts moved endlessly through systems of control, identity, and hidden meaning, sleep became irregular. Obsessive patterns intensified. Certain behavioral routines repeated constantly because routine created temporary emotional stability against the growing instability inside his own mind. Yet even during these moments, he still believed himself sane. More than sane, superior. That was the tragedy. Strange genuinely viewed his psychological deterioration as evidence of deeper awareness rather than illness. Emotional isolation became intellectual discipline in his mind. Obsession became dedication. Narcissism became enlightenment. Paranoia became necessary caution. Every unhealthy transformation received new meaning capable of protecting his self-image from collapse. And because he was a psychiatrist, he possessed the vocabulary necessary to justify nearly anything psychologically. This made self-awareness almost impossible for him. There were moments when fragments of reality briefly broke through. Small flashes where he recognized exhaustion, emotional instability, or the frightening intensity of his own obsession. Sometimes, while staring into dark reflections or reviewing endless Batman files late into the night, Strange experienced faint moments of unease about what he was becoming, but those moments never lasted. His ego crushed them quickly, because admitting instability would destroy the identity he had spent years constructing. Hugo Strange needed to believe he stood above ordinary human weakness. Without that belief, everything beneath his carefully controlled exterior would begin collapsing at once. So instead, he doubled down on superiority. He convinced himself other people simply lacked the courage to confront truth fully. Society feared his methods because society feared understanding itself. Batman resisted him because Batman could not emotionally accept the psychological truths Strange had uncovered. Every conflict reinforced his delusions. Every criticism strengthened his certainty. And every year, the distance between doctor and patient grew smaller without him realizing it. That was perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Inside Arkham Asylum, countless patients lived trapped by obsessions, distorted beliefs, fractured identities, and emotional instability. Strange spent years studying them clinically while believing himself separate from their suffering. Yet slowly, almost invisibly, he had drifted toward the same darkness through different pathways, not through emotional chaos, but through intellectual arrogance, not through confusion, but through certainty, not through weakness, but through obsession powerful enough to consume individuality itself. And somewhere beneath all the surveillance systems, hidden archives, psychological theories, and endless pursuit of control, Hugo Strange had become exactly the kind of damaged mind he once believed only existed behind locked asylum doors. The difference was that he still wore the white coat of a doctor, while the collapse unfolded quietly underneath. Why Hugo Strange is so disturbing. There are many terrifying figures moving through Gotham's history. Men and women whose crimes leave visible destruction across the city through explosions, murder, chaos, and public violence. And because those horrors arrive loudly, people often recognize the danger immediately. Citizens hear gunfire, buildings burn, crowds scream, blood appears on the pavement beneath flashing police lights. The threat becomes visible, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Gotham has always produced criminals who turn fear into spectacle, figures who announce themselves dramatically through destruction, large enough for the entire city to witness. But Hugo Strange feels different from those people, and that difference is exactly what makes him so disturbing. Because the fear surrounding Strange does not come primarily from what he destroys physically, it comes from what he understands emotionally. Most Gotham villains attack the body, the law, or the city itself. Strange attacks identity. He moves quietly through emotional space most people spend their entire lives protecting from strangers. He studies vulnerability with clinical patience. He listens too carefully. He notices things ordinary people miss. And once he understands someone deeply enough, he no longer sees them as fully human in the emotional sense. He sees them as systems, weaknesses, psychological structures waiting to be opened. That idea creates a very different kind of horror from Gotham's louder criminals because it touches something deeply personal inside almost everyone. Most people can imagine protecting themselves from physical danger in some way. They can lock doors, avoid dangerous streets, or fight back against visible threats. But Hugo Strange represents a fear much harder to defend against. The fear that another human being might see through every emotional layer protecting your inner self and use that understanding against you without hesitation. That fear feels intimate, violating, almost impossible to escape. Part of what separates Strange from figures like the Joker or other violent Gotham criminals is the absence of emotional chaos in the way he operates. Strange rarely loses control publicly. He does not scream during breakdowns or announce himself through dramatic destruction. Instead, he speaks calmly, dresses professionally, and presents himself as educated, intelligent, and rational. He often looks more trustworthy than dangerous. And that makes him feel more real. Because in the real world, some of the most frightening harm people experience does not come from obvious monsters. It comes from authority figures trusted to help others. Doctors, therapists, institutional leaders, researchers, officials, teachers, or powerful individuals who slowly abuse emotional access while appearing respectable on the surface. This is why Hugo Strange unsettles people so deeply, even beyond comic books and fictional Gotham. His horror connects directly to real fears surrounding abuse of authority, psychological manipulation, unethical experimentation, surveillance, institutional corruption, and emotional control hidden behind professional language. He represents the nightmare of trust becoming dangerous. A patient enters a therapy session, expecting safety, Instead, their trauma becomes ammunition. A vulnerable person confesses fear during treatment. Instead of compassion, they encounter observation. A frightened mind seeks understanding. Instead, it becomes material for manipulation. This type of horror feels deeply human because it reflects situations that exist outside fiction. Throughout history, there have been real institutions and authority figures who use psychological knowledge, medical systems, surveillance, or emotional vulnerability to control people rather than protect them. Strange feels disturbing because he embodies that possibility perfectly. He is what happens when intelligence loses empathy completely. And unlike many Gotham villains, Strange rarely appears emotionally monstrous externally. He often sounds reasonable, logical, calm, even polite. That calmness creates enormous discomfort because human beings instinctively expect cruelty to look violent or unstable. Strange challenges that expectation entirely. He proves someone can speak softly while causing devastating emotional damage. In many ways, the true horror surrounding him comes from emotional exposure itself. Most people carry private fears they rarely share openly. Shame, trauma, insecurity, grief, hidden thoughts, emotional wounds buried beneath years of careful social performance. Human identity depends partly on choosing who gains access to those vulnerable spaces. Trust matters because vulnerability without safety becomes terrifying. Hugo Strange destroys that safety. He studies people without permission emotionally. He examines fear like a scientist examining biological tissue. He listens not to connect, but to uncover weakness. The moment he learns what someone fears most, the relationship changes permanently because Strange no longer sees a person standing in front of him. He sees access. This creates one of the deepest psychological fears imaginable. The fear of being known completely by someone incapable of compassion, because knowledge without empathy becomes dangerous very quickly. A compassionate therapist might understand trauma in order to help someone heal. Strange understands trauma in order to predict, manipulate, and dominate. He removes humanity from emotional understanding itself. Pain becomes information, fear becomes leverage, shame becomes pressure point. Even love or grief can become strategic tools once translated into psychological systems. That coldness is horrifying because it strips emotional experiences of meaning beyond usefulness. And unlike criminals driven by rage or emotional instability, Strange often feels emotionally empty while doing this. There is rarely passion behind his cruelty, rarely visible hatred. He harms people with the detached precision of someone adjusting machinery rather than interacting with human beings carrying real emotional suffering. This is why his character creates such a uniquely uncomfortable atmosphere. Strange does not merely hurt people. He dissects them psychologically. There is also something deeply disturbing about the way he blurs boundaries between observation and violation. Human beings naturally observe each other emotionally to some extent. People notice expressions, tone, fear, attraction, sadness, and insecurity during ordinary life. But Strange takes this natural behavior to terrifying extremes. He studies others obsessively, cataloging emotional details with invasive precision, while convincing himself it represents intelligence rather than violation. He turns intimacy into surveillance. That transformation feels deeply unsettling because it removes consent entirely from emotional exposure. Victims often never realize how much he knows until it is already too late. And by then, Strange usually understands enough about their fears to destabilize them psychologically without using physical force at all. This connects to another reason his character feels so frightening. He proves minds can be destroyed quietly. Popular stories often focus on visible violence because physical harm creates immediate dramatic impact. Strange reminds people that psychological destruction can happen invisibly over time through manipulation, pressure, humiliation, surveillance, and emotional destabilization. Someone may leave an encounter with him carrying no bruises whatsoever, while internally feeling shattered. That kind of damage feels difficult to explain or prove, which makes it even more terrifying. His obsession with Batman also reveals disturbing truths about the nature of intellectual cruelty. Strange does not simply want to defeat Batman physically, he wants access to him emotionally. He wants to peel away identity layer by layer until Bruce Wayne's deepest psychological wounds stand fully exposed beneath his control. That desire reveals how Strange views other human beings fundamentally, not as people deserving privacy or emotional dignity, but as puzzles existing for his satisfaction. This worldview destroys empathy completely, because empathy requires respecting emotional boundaries. Strange respects no boundary. Once curiosity becomes involved, intelligence alone guides him now. And intelligence without empathy often becomes colder than open hatred, because hatred at least recognizes emotional significance. Strange frequently seems beyond even that. His cruelty becomes analytical, clinical, intellectual, and this creates another deeply uncomfortable idea surrounding him: the possibility that intelligence itself can become monstrous when disconnected from compassion. Society often celebrates intelligence automatically, assuming knowledge leads toward wisdom or progress. Hugo Strange represents the opposite possibility. He shows how intelligence can amplify cruelty when empathy disappears entirely. The smarter he becomes, the more dangerous he grows, because every new psychological insight simply gives him additional ways to manipulate vulnerable minds more effectively. And perhaps most disturbing of all is the fact that Strange genuinely believes he is right. He does not view himself as evil in the traditional sense. He believes he understands humanity more honestly than everyone else. He sees emotional vulnerability as weakness, privacy as illusion, morality as limitation, compassion as emotional interference preventing deeper truth. That certainty makes him frightening in ways ordinary villains often are not, because people driven purely by chaos eventually destroy themselves recklessly. But someone convinced they are intellectually justified can continue causing harm endlessly while still viewing themselves as rational. Late at night, when Gotham's endless noise fades into distant traffic and cold rain drifts silently between towering buildings, it becomes easier to understand why Hugo Strange lingers in the imagination differently from many other villains. Somewhere behind locked doors and glowing surveillance screens sits a man who understands fear intimately, who can identify emotional weakness with terrifying accuracy, and who believes knowing another person deeply enough gives him the right to control them. Not through rage, not through spectacle, but through understanding, stripped completely of empathy. And perhaps that is what makes him one of Gotham's most disturbing figures of all, because deep down, many people fear physical monsters. But even more people fear someone calmly looking into their mind and deciding their pain is useful. The relationship between Strange and Batman. There are moments in Gotham's history when certain people begin to resemble each other in unsettling ways, not because they share the same goals, but because they are shaped by similar wounds, similar obsessions, and similar emotional isolation, until the line separating hero and monster becomes difficult to examine comfortably. Few relationships reveal this more clearly than the strange connection between Hugo Strange and Batman, because beneath the conflict, beneath the surveillance, manipulation, and endless psychological warfare, there exists something deeply disturbing tying them together. Recognition, not friendship, not trust, but recognition. Strange sees pieces of himself reflected in Batman constantly, and part of what makes his obsession so powerful is the belief that he understands Batman not as ordinary enemies understand each other, but as someone looking into a distorted mirror. He studies Batman with such intensity because, deep down, he recognizes familiar structures hiding beneath the mask. Discipline, isolation, obsession, emotional control, fear transformed into identity. Both men shaped themselves around trauma so completely that ordinary life eventually became impossible for them. And perhaps, most unsettling of all, both men built entire identities designed to operate above Gotham's normal human world. This is what makes their relationship feel so psychologically uncomfortable compared to simpler hero and villain conflicts. Strange is not merely fascinated by Batman's strength or intelligence. He is fascinated because he believes they are fundamentally alike in ways Batman himself refuses to admit openly. In some ways, he is correct. Both men are deeply obsessive. Neither knows how to stop once a goal takes hold emotionally. Batman patrols Gotham endlessly despite exhaustion, injury, and emotional isolation because his mission has consumed his entire life. Strange pursues understanding and control with the same relentless intensity, sacrificing ordinary human connection for psychological obsession. Neither man rests normally, neither trusts easily. Neither lives comfortably within ordinary society. They exist beside humanity rather than fully inside it. That similarity matters deeply. Both men also understand fear more intimately than almost anyone else in Gotham. Batman weaponizes fear against criminals by transforming himself into something larger than human, a symbol moving through darkness, designed to unsettle violent minds emotionally before physical confrontation even begins. Strange studies fear academically and psychologically, learning how panic, shame, uncertainty, and emotional exposure reshape behavior beneath pressure. They approach fear differently, but both recognize its power completely. This creates a disturbing sense that Strange and Batman speak partially the same emotional language, even while standing on opposite sides of morality. They both know human beings reveal deeper truths when frightened. They both understand how symbols affect behavior. They both operate through secrecy and psychological influence more than ordinary force. And both wear masks. But the reasons behind those masks reveal the most important difference between them. Batman's mask exists partly to protect others from Bruce Wayne's pain. After witnessing the murder of his parents as a child, Bruce transformed fear into purpose so that no one else would suffer helplessly the way he once did. The mask became armor, symbol, and emotional shield all at once. Batman hides Bruce Wayne's wounds beneath discipline because he wants to stop Gotham's violence from spreading further. There is still compassion beneath the mask, still grief, still humanity. Strange's mask operates differently. His calm professionalism, intellectual confidence, and medical authority hide not wounded compassion, but emotional emptiness, growing larger every year. He hides behind the image of respected psychiatrist because that identity grants access, control, and power over vulnerable people. Where Batman's secrecy protects others, Strange's secrecy protects obsession. Batman hides pain beneath strength. Strange hides instability beneath intellect. Both conceal themselves, but one mask exists to defend. The other exists to consume. This distinction is what ultimately separates them, despite all their similarities. Yet Strange refuses to fully accept that difference, because acknowledging it would force him to confront something unbearable, the possibility that Batman remained human in ways Strange no longer was. Instead, Strange convinces himself that Batman simply lacks the courage to admit the darker truths both of them supposedly understand already. He believes Batman's morality is temporary restraint, emotional weakness, delaying inevitable acceptance of psychological dominance and fear as humanity's natural structure. This belief becomes central to Strange's obsession. He studies Batman constantly because he sees him not only as mystery, but as potential proof that his worldview is correct. If Batman and Strange share the same psychological foundations, then perhaps morality itself becomes meaningless decoration, hiding deeper truths about power, trauma, and control. That idea comforts Strange enormously, because without it, he must confront the horrifying reality that two people can suffer similar emotional wounds and still choose completely different paths afterward. And that possibility threatens everything Strange believes about himself. The deeper their conflict grows, the more Batman begins representing something deeply personal to Strange emotionally. Not just opposition, but judgment. Batman becomes living evidence that intelligence, discipline, and psychological understanding do not automatically require cruelty. That truth infuriates Strange because it exposes the choices hiding beneath his philosophy. Batman uses fear while still protecting life. Strange uses understanding while stripping away dignity. Batman studies criminals but refuses to dehumanize people completely. Strange studies vulnerability until humanity disappears beneath systems and patterns. This is why Strange increasingly tries to psychologically dismantle Batman rather than merely defeat him physically. He wants to prove Batman is secretly just like him, underneath the moral language and heroic symbolism. He wants Bruce Wayne's compassion to collapse publicly, because such a collapse would validate Strange's own worldview completely. If Batman breaks emotionally enough, then Strange no longer has to face the possibility that he himself chose the darker path willingly. That emotional motivation hides beneath much of their relationship. In many ways, Strange becomes obsessed with forcing Batman to see himself through Strange's eyes, as another psychologically damaged figure driven by obsession, fear, and emotional isolation rather than genuine heroism. He constantly searches for contradictions within Batman's behavior, because those contradictions reassure him that morality is merely illusion, hiding deeper emotional instability. Yet despite all this, Batman never fully becomes what Strange wants him to become, and that frustrates Strange endlessly. Because no matter how deeply Batman's trauma shapes him, compassion continues surviving underneath. Bruce Wayne still mourns suffering. He still protects vulnerable people. He still believes human life matters, even while moving through Gotham's darkness every night. Strange cannot fully understand this because empathy has deteriorated too deeply inside him over time. That difference changes everything. Without compassion, obsession becomes consumption. Without empathy, understanding becomes violation. Without humanity, intelligence becomes cold machinery, stripping people apart emotionally for control. This is why Strange ultimately feels like a dark reflection of Batman rather than his equal. He mirrors many of Batman's traits externally: discipline, secrecy, emotional isolation, obsession, psychological insight, but lacks the moral center preventing those traits from becoming monstrous completely. He represents what Batman might become if grief finally erased compassion entirely. That possibility haunts their relationship constantly. At times, Batman likely recognizes pieces of himself inside Strange as well, though in very different ways. Strange reveals the danger hidden inside obsession without emotional grounding. He demonstrates how easily intelligence and trauma can transform into cruelty when empathy disappears. Looking at Strange means looking at a future where psychological isolation consumed everything human underneath the mask. That mirror effect makes their conflict more intimate than ordinary battles between hero and villain. Neither man exists comfortably within normal society anymore. Both operate from shadows. Both sacrifice ordinary human life for larger missions. Both study fear intensely. Both transform trauma into identity. Yet the small emotional differences between them create enormous moral distance. Batman still sees people. Strange sees structures. Batman fears becoming monstrous. Strange embraces superiority over ordinary humanity. Batman protects vulnerability. Strange exploits it. Those differences are everything, and perhaps that is why Strange's obsession with Batman becomes so emotionally consuming over time. Batman represents the version of himself Strange can never become anymore, someone shaped by darkness, who still chooses restraint, compassion, and protection, despite carrying enormous psychological pain internally. For Strange, this feels almost offensive, because if Batman can remain human after suffering so much, then Strange must eventually confront the truth that his own cruelty was not inevitable. It was chosen. That realization lingers beneath all their interactions, whether spoken openly or not. Late at night, while Gotham's skyline disappears beneath cold rain and pale light reflects against silent rooftops above the sleeping city. The strange relationship between Batman and Hugo Strange begins to feel less like simple conflict and more like two damaged minds staring into different versions of the same darkness. One became a guardian shaped by pain. The other became an observer consumed by it. And standing between them is the fragile line separating understanding from control, fear from compassion, and obsession from humanity itself. Gotham's endless cycle of damaged minds. There is something deeply unsettling about Gotham that goes beyond its criminals, beyond its violence, and even beyond the masks moving through its rooftops at night. Because after enough time spent studying the city closely, a disturbing pattern begins to appear beneath everything else. A pattern suggesting Gotham does not simply attract damaged people, but slowly creates them over and over again through endless pressure, neglect, fear, and emotional exhaustion until broken minds become part of the city's natural rhythm. This is what makes Gotham feel different from ordinary places. Pain never fully leaves. It spreads. One generation passes trauma into the next. Children grow up hearing gunshots outside apartment windows. Families hide addiction and abuse behind thin walls while pretending everything is normal during the day. Corrupt officials protect wealth while poor neighborhoods collapse slowly into hopelessness. Violence becomes ordinary enough that many citizens stop reacting emotionally unless the horror becomes extreme. And over time, the city itself begins shaping human psychology in dangerous ways. A child raised in constant fear learns distrust early. A teenager surrounded by crime learns survival before compassion. A lonely person, ignored long enough, may eventually stop believing connection is possible. Someone humiliated repeatedly may begin carrying hidden rage everywhere they go. Gotham produces emotional wounds constantly, not always through dramatic tragedy, but through endless, smaller injuries accumulating over years until entire lives become shaped around pain. This cycle affects nearly everyone inside the city to some degree. Some become violent, some become isolated, some lose hope quietly while continuing ordinary routines. Others, like Hugo Strange, transform their damage into something colder and more dangerous over time. But the important thing is that Gotham rarely creates monsters from nothing. The city weakens people first. That truth matters deeply when trying to understand why so many psychologically unstable figures emerge from Gotham repeatedly. It is easy to look at criminals, vigilantes, corrupt officials, or damaged minds individually and imagine each one as separate from the city around them. But Gotham behaves more like an emotional ecosystem where fear, neglect, corruption, and trauma constantly feed each other in endless cycles. Violence creates grief. Grief creates anger. Anger creates isolation. Isolation creates obsession. And obsession, left untreated long enough, can reshape entire identities. Hugo Strange understood parts of this process more clearly than most people, which is partly why his character feels so tragic beneath the horror. He studied Gotham's psychological decay for years and recognized patterns many others ignored completely. He saw how corruption protected suffering rather than healing it. He saw how institutions designed to help people often became overwhelmed, careless, or abusive themselves. He saw how trauma moved through the city almost like weather, touching thousands of lives constantly. But instead of responding with compassion, Strange responded with detachment and control. That difference changed everything, because Gotham creates many damaged people, but not everyone chooses the same path afterward. Still, it is impossible to separate Strange entirely from the city that shaped him. His obsession with fear, control, and psychological collapse did not appear in empty space. Gotham provided endless examples reinforcing his worldview. Everywhere he looked, pain reshaped human behavior exactly the way he believed it would. Corrupt leaders manipulated, frightened citizens. Criminal organizations used intimidation to maintain power. Poor neighborhoods suffered abandonment, while wealthy districts protected themselves through money and private security. Mental illness spread through populations already struggling beneath violence and economic pressure. Even children growing up in Gotham often learned emotional survival strategies far earlier than they should have. The city quietly taught people that fear controlled behavior more effectively than kindness, and Hugo Strange absorbed that lesson completely. This is what makes Gotham's relationship with Arkham Asylum especially disturbing as well. Officially, Arkham exists to treat damaged minds and protect society from dangerous individuals. But in practice, the institution often functions more like temporary containment for symptoms rather than meaningful healing. Patients cycle endlessly through the system without addressing the deeper forces destroying them emotionally in the first place. Someone experiences trauma. That trauma becomes violence, obsession, addiction, or psychological collapse. Arkham contains the result temporarily, then the cycle begins again somewhere else. Very little changes underneath. This endless repetition slowly transforms Arkham into something tragic. The institution becomes overwhelmed not only by individual illness, but by Gotham itself, continuously producing new suffering faster than healing systems can manage. Doctors treat breakdowns without stopping the conditions causing them. Security measures increase while emotional support weakens. Public fear grows stronger while compassion fades further into the background. And inside this collapsing system, someone like Hugo Strange rises naturally. That is one of the darkest truths surrounding his story. He is both creator and product of Gotham's psychological decay at the same time. The city helped shape his worldview long before he began shaping others through manipulation and control. Years spent observing corruption, emotional instability, institutional failure, and endless violence convinced him humanity was fundamentally weak beneath pressure. Gotham seemed to prove his theories constantly. Every scandal, every murder, every emotional collapse reinforced his belief that fear and trauma ultimately governed human behavior more honestly than morality or compassion. But Gotham also failed Strange in quieter ways. A healthier environment might have recognized warning signs earlier. Stronger institutions might have challenged his methods before they expanded into cruelty. Genuine emotional connection might have interrupted his growing isolation before obsession consumed him entirely. Instead, Gotham rewarded intelligence, regardless of empathy, and protected authority figures, as long as they appeared useful publicly. So Strange kept rising, and Gotham kept breaking people. This cycle creates one of the most painful aspects of the city itself. Many Gotham villains and damaged minds are not simply evil in simplistic ways. They are emotionally fractured individuals shaped by environments that repeatedly failed them long before they became dangerous publicly. Some experienced childhood abuse. Others suffered loss, neglect, abandonment, addiction, or endless exposure to violence. Gotham often wounds people deeply before punishing the damage afterward. That does not excuse cruelty, but it explains why the city keeps producing it. Even Batman exists because Gotham failed a frightened child standing beside his murdered parents in a dark alley. The city created both the vigilante and the criminals he fights. In many ways, Gotham continuously manufactures emotional extremes because ordinary stability becomes difficult to maintain beneath constant pressure and fear. This is why Arkham never truly solves the city's problems. It treats aftermath, not origins. A violent criminal enters the asylum after emotional collapse already occurred. A damaged mind arrives after years of trauma, corruption, neglect, or obsession shaped their identity slowly over time. The institution locks doors, monitors behavior, administers medication, and attempts rehabilitation. But outside those walls, Gotham continues creating fresh suffering every single day. More frightened children, more broken families, more corruption, more isolation, more emotional wounds spreading quietly through lives nobody important notices until too late. And because the causes remain alive, the cycle never stops. Hugo Strange eventually becomes one of the clearest symbols of this cycle. He causes enormous psychological harm, manipulates vulnerable people, abuses authority, and spreads fear through systems built around emotional control. Yet he also reflects Gotham's deeper illness perfectly. A city obsessed with secrecy creates someone obsessed with exposure. A city ruled by fear creates someone fascinated by psychological dominance. A city neglecting emotional healing creates a psychiatrist who abandons empathy completely. Strange is horrifying partly because Gotham made room for him to become what he became. Not entirely, his choices still matter, but environments matter too. And Gotham constantly surrounds people with conditions capable of turning emotional damage into something much darker if left untreated long enough. There is also something deeply sad about how ordinary citizens inside Gotham slowly adapt to this endless suffering over time. Many people become emotionally numb simply to survive daily life. Violence stops shocking them. Corruption feels expected. Fear becomes routine. This emotional exhaustion weakens the city's ability to recognize deeper problems because everyone becomes too overwhelmed, managing immediate survival. In places where suffering lasts too long, people often stop believing meaningful healing is possible. That hopelessness spreads quietly across Gotham, and hopelessness creates fertile ground for damaged minds. Late at night, when cold rain drifts between towering buildings and distant sirens, echoes softly through streets, glowing beneath weak streetlights, Gotham begins to feel less like a city and more like a living emotional wound, struggling endlessly against itself. Somewhere, frightened children try to sleep while arguments echo through apartment walls. Somewhere else, lonely figures walk empty sidewalks, carrying anger they barely understand anymore. Inside Arkham, damaged minds stare through reinforced glass, while doctors and guards move through exhausted routines beneath flickering lights. And hidden among all of it are people like Hugo Strange, individuals shaped by the same city they helped make more frightening afterward. Because in Gotham, horror rarely comes from one source alone. It grows through cycles. Fear creating damage, damage creating obsession, obsession creating new suffering, again and again, until eventually the city begins feeling trapped inside its own endless psychological nightmare, unable to fully heal because the pain producing that nightmare never truly disappears in the first place. In the end, what makes Hugo Strange so frightening is not his strength, not his laboratories, not even the terrible things he did inside Gotham's hidden rooms and broken institutions, but something far quieter and far more uncomfortable, which is the simple fact that he understands human weakness too well. He sees the fragile parts people spend their entire lives hiding from strangers, the fears buried beneath confidence, the shame hidden beneath anger, the loneliness concealed behind power, and once he sees those things, he no longer treats them with care or compassion. He treats them like tools. That is the quiet horror surrounding him. And now, as the cold halls of Arkham begin to fade into the distance, and the endless noise of Gotham softens beneath the quiet rhythm of the night, the story of Hugo Strange slowly settles into silence. No longer sharp or frightening, but distant, like rain falling softly against dark city windows far away. The minds we explored, the fears uncovered, and the hidden wounds buried beneath masks and authority no longer ask to be solved, only understood for a moment before they drift gently out of view. You may notice how the city itself feels calmer now, as though Gotham is finally resting beneath the fog and pale streetlights, while its endless secrets grow quiet for the night. Strange spent his life searching too deeply into the minds of others, believing understanding alone could bring control. Yet in the end, it was compassion he failed to hold on to. And as your thoughts begin to slow, and the shadows of Gotham grow softer and more distant, you can simply let the story fade away into the quiet night, where the rain keeps falling gently, the city keeps sleeping, and everything slowly disappears into stillness.